The first light of dawn filtered through the dense forest, scattering gold across the uneven terrain where our ancestors stirred from sleep. A soft murmur rose among the early humans, a combination of curiosity, instinct, and the inchoate need to connect. Long before cities, before writing, before civilization itself, there existed the simple, profound act of speaking. Words had no grammar, no punctuation, no dictionaries to bind them, yet even in their infancy, they carried immense power. In these murmurs lay the roots of something that would define humanity: storytelling. In this primordial world, communication was survival. A grunt might warn of a predator, a gesture could indicate food. But beyond necessity, humans instinctively reached towards something more subtle, something deeply emotional. Imagine a small group gathered in a shaded clearing, the morning mist curling around them. A mother leans close to her child, her face etched with both caution and affection. She begins to hum a melody, simple and unstructured, yet filled with intention. Her voice, warm and rhythmic, penetrates the uncertainty of the day. It is, perhaps, the earliest attempt to bridge the divide between fear and reassurance, between the unknown outside and the safety inside. These first murmured sentences, if they could even be called sentences, were more than practical signals. They were the beginning of narrative, the genesis of a tradition that would last tens of thousands of years. To soothe a child, a caregiver did not merely feed or shelter them, they began to shape the contours of imagination. A story, even in its most rudimentary form, could transform the harsh reality of the world into a manageable, comprehensible experience. Fear was acknowledged but contained. Danger became a story to understand, not merely a threat to endure. Archaeologists and anthropologists today infer the birth of these early narratives from fragments, the placement of early shelters, the traces of pigments on cave walls, the patterns of early human gatherings. These clues suggest that humans were not only surviving but creating spaces where emotional needs could be addressed. The act of storytelling may have arisen not as entertainment but as an essential mechanism of care. In the quiet moments, when the wind stirred the trees and the distant roar of predators echoed through the landscape, humans reached for one another. A voice was raised, a gesture offered, a story born. The sounds of this first storytelling were likely as much about rhythm as about meaning. Repetition, cadence, and tone would have been tools to draw the child's attention and lull them into a sense of safety. Imagine the gentle rise and fall of the caregiver's voice, echoing across the stones and trees, blending seamlessly with the natural world. There was no need for elaborate language. Each murmur, each tone, conveyed care, patience, and the assurance that the child was seen and protected. Here, in these subtle auditory patterns, was the beginning of something extraordinary, the recognition that words themselves could comfort, could heal, and could shape thought. And yet, storytelling in this early stage was fragile. Without written records, without durable media, these narratives existed solely in memory, passed from one person to another through repetition and care. Each telling carried the imprint of both storyteller and listener, evolving with each retelling. A story began not as a fixed tale but as a living, breathing organism shaped by human empathy and the rhythms of daily life. In this way, the first stories told to comfort a child were also the first experiments in preserving humanity itself, its fears, its hopes, and its capacity for love. Consider the significance of this act. In a world dominated by uncertainty, where survival required constant vigilance and adaptability, humans still paused to nurture imagination. The first story was, in essence, a radical declaration. Even in the face of danger, the human mind sought beauty, connection, and understanding. It was the moment when words transcended function and became art, morality, and solace all at once. A child's coo, a mother's hum, a father's whispered encouragement, these were the first threads of culture, woven not from tools or fire, but from the intangible yet indelible force of story. As the day progressed, the voices would disperse, carrying the faint echoes of these first narratives across valleys and streams. Yet within that child, within the attentive mind of the listener, a seed had been planted. Even without structure, even without syntax, the story achieved its purpose. It comforted, it reassured, it connected. The act of speaking was now inseparable from the act of caring. And thus, in the soft dawn of human history, the first story was told, not to entertain, not to instruct, but to soothe the trembling heart of a child. By understanding this moment, we glimpse the essence of humanity itself, a species capable of transforming fear into wonder, chaos into comprehension, and isolation into connection. The first story told to comfort a child was the first conscious act of empathy, a fragile yet powerful bridge between minds, a precursor to the vast, intricate web of narratives that would one day span continents, centuries, and civilizations. In the soft cadence of those first words, the human story began, quietly, intimately, and eternally. In the dim interior of a cave, where sunlight barely reached and shadows clung to the walls like restless spirits, a child huddled close to their caregiver. The world outside was vast and unpredictable, a place of predators, storms, and unseen dangers. Inside, however, there existed a fragile sanctuary, a space defined by warmth, safety, and the rhythmic pulse of human presence. The child's wide eyes reflected flickering firelight, and their small body trembled, not solely from cold, but from the instinctual awareness of vulnerability. From the earliest moments of life, humans depended on one another for survival. But survival alone did not satisfy the needs of the young. Beyond food, beyond shelter, there was a profound psychological necessity, the need to feel seen, understood, and protected. The caregiver's role extended beyond tending to the physical. It encompassed the emotional and the imaginative. It is within these intimate moments, in the gentle cradle of arms and the soft cadence of voice, that the first stories were born. The child's gaze was fixed on the caregiver, absorbing every nuance of expression, every gesture, every subtle shift in tone. Even before words had fully formed, there existed a language of comfort. A humming melody, a rhythmic tap on the stone floor, or the soft murmur of a narrative could communicate safety more powerfully than any action alone. The story, in its earliest form, was a bridge, connecting the child's fear with the caregiver's assurance, the unknown outside with the warmth inside. Anthropologists suggest that these moments were likely universal, recurring in every human group across millennia. The act of comforting a child through narrative was not a cultural luxury, it was a survival strategy. Children who could manage fear, who learned through observation and imaginative engagement, were more likely to navigate the dangers of their environment successfully. Yet the stories were never purely utilitarian. They were emotional scaffolds, allowing children to process the uncertainty of existence while fostering trust, curiosity, and imagination. In these dimly lit caves, stories may have taken simple forms, a rhythm of words repeated, a melodic intonation, a sequence of sounds that mimicked the natural world. Perhaps a tale described the fox that eluded hunters, the river that carved the land, or the distant thunder that echoed through the valley. Each story served a dual purpose, to entertain or distract from fear, and to embed an intuitive understanding of the world. For the child, the story was a lens through which reality could be softened, reframed, and comprehended. Consider the physicality of the scene. The caregiver's hand brushes the child's hair, offering tactile reassurance. Firelight dances across faces and walls, creating shifting patterns that become part of the narrative, shadows acting as characters or dangers within the story. The child reaches toward these flickering shapes, eyes wide with wonder, learning the boundary between imagination and reality. The story, though oral and ephemeral, transforms the cave into a theater of understanding, empathy, and emotional growth. Even at this primitive stage, humans were experimenting with narrative structure. Repetition, suspense, and rhythm were employed. Instinctively, a caregiver might pause at a critical moment, allowing the child's imagination to fill the silence. The child's reactions, tension, giggles, sighs, fed back into the telling, shaping it in real time. In this symbiotic exchange, story and listener co-evolve. Each act of narration became a teaching moment, a comforting ritual, and a rehearsal for facing life's uncertainties. The emotional intelligence embedded in these early stories is remarkable. By addressing fear, curiosity, and the need for connection, the first tales to comfort a child were also the first exercises in empathy. The child learned to recognize patterns of safety and danger, to navigate emotions, and to anticipate consequences, all within the safe confines of the cave. The narrative acted as a rehearsal space for the imagination, where lessons were internalized without direct threat. Beyond the immediate exchange between child and caregiver, these stories created a sense of continuity and belonging. The child was introduced to a lineage of knowledge, a tacit understanding that others had survived, thrived, and protected the next generation before them. Even if the words themselves would be lost over time, the emotional imprint endured. The child's sense of security, fostered by story, became a cornerstone of cognitive and social development. It is within these early, intimate narratives that we glimpse the essence of human culture, a deliberate act to nurture, teach, and connect through imagination. The cave, though cold and dark, became a crucible for storytelling. The child, attentive and responsive, was both audience and co-creator, shaping the evolution of the tale with subtle cues and reactions. The first stories told to comfort a child were not static, they were living entities, growing and adapting with each telling, each heartbeat, each flicker of firelight. And so, in the quiet of the cave, amid shadows and whispers, the first story unfolded. It was not recorded in stone or clay, nor carved into wood or bone. It existed only in memory, in emotion, in the tender bond between caregiver and child. Yet in that fragile, fleeting moment, humanity took a profound step, the recognition that words, shaped with care and intention, could comfort, educate, and connect. The child's sigh of relief, the relaxed curl of small hands, the fleeting smile, these were the earliest proof that storytelling was more than communication. It was a lifeline, a bridge across fear, and the seed of culture itself. Long before written language, before stone tablets or clay tablets or ink-stained scrolls, stories traveled silently between hearts and minds. They were carried not in ink but in memory, passed from one human to another through repetition, ritual, and the quiet urgency of care. In the flickering light of a fire or the hush of a cave, legends took shape, whispered words that sought to comfort, to teach, and to explain a world that was often harsh, unpredictable, and dangerous. These whispered legends were more than idle entertainment. They were functional, emotional, and deeply human. Anthropologists argue that the earliest stories served a dual purpose, to encode survival knowledge and to soothe the psychological anxieties of the young. A tale about a prowling predator, for example, did more than warn of danger. It taught the child how to respond, how to anticipate, and how to feel a measure of control. At the same time, the same story offered reassurance, the caregiver's voice, the rhythm of the telling, the knowledge that the child was not alone, all combined to soothe fear and foster a sense of security. Consider the layers of meaning in these first narratives. The predator that lurked beyond the firelight could be a literal threat, but it could also serve as a symbol, a representation of fear itself, of uncertainty, of the uncontrollable forces of the world. By embedding such lessons in story, early humans created a cognitive space in which emotion could be managed. The child learned not only about danger but about courage, vigilance, and trust. The story became a mirror of life, reflecting both the peril and the protection that existed in the human experience. Legends were likely enriched by gesture, song, and the tactile environment. A caregiver might tap on a stone to mimic thunder, sway their body to suggest movement, or adjust the firelight to animate the narrative's characters. Early storytelling was not static, it was an immersive, multisensory experience. The child's imagination, stimulated by sound, motion, and shadow, transformed the tale into a living encounter. Each retelling shaped perception, memory, and emotional response, creating a shared language between storyteller and listener. These whispered legends also served as vessels of cultural memory. In societies without writing, stories were the primary method of passing knowledge across generations. Tales of triumph, caution, ingenuity, and morality were encoded in the rhythms, repetitions, and motifs of narrative. Every time a story was told, it preserved the essence of human experience, its fears, hopes, mistakes, and triumphs. In this way, the first legends were not merely comforting, they were foundational, laying the groundwork for culture, identity, and collective memory. Imagine a child nestled in the crook of a caregiver's arm, listening to a story of a clever fox or a mighty bear. The details of the story, its shape, its rhythm, its pauses, were carefully attuned to the child's attention, guiding them through suspense, relief, and wonder. The caregiver adjusted the telling based on the child's reactions, a quiver of fear, a gasp of excitement, a soft coo of delight. In these small interactions, the story evolved. It was not fixed, not immutable, it was alive, shaped by empathy, observation, and the deep instinct to nurture. Whispered legends were also laboratories of imagination. Early humans, despite their precarious circumstances, understood that imagination was a vital tool. A child who could envision a scenario, anticipate outcomes, and mentally rehearse actions was better prepared to navigate both physical and social challenges. Stories that comforted did so not by shielding children from reality but by giving them a mental framework to process it. The narrative transformed fear into understanding, helplessness into insight, and confusion into structured comprehension. Language itself in these early stories was inherently musical and rhythmic. Repetition, cadence, and pitch variations were employed intuitively, drawing attention and creating emotional resonance. A simple refrain, repeated across generations, could anchor the child's attention, provide predictability, and offer reassurance in the face of uncertainty. These early linguistic patterns reveal that storytelling was never purely functional. It was an art form, a practice that harmonized sound, emotion, and cognition in ways that would persist for tens of thousands of years. Even in the most rudimentary legends, morality and ethics emerged. Tales might describe cooperation among animals, cleverness in solving problems, or the consequences of fear and greed. In each instance, the story imparted lessons that were deeply practical yet emotionally resonant. A child absorbed not only survival strategies but also the rudimentary rules of social interaction, empathy, and fairness. Whispered legends, then, were simultaneously emotional support, educational tool, and ethical primer, a multidimensional approach to human development that has endured to the present day. The communal aspect of these stories cannot be overstated. While the focus is often on the child being comforted, storytelling occurred within social networks. Families, clans, and groups gathered to share narratives, reinforcing bonds, transmitting knowledge, and creating a collective consciousness. The child was both recipient and participant, learning to attune to the emotions, intentions, and rhythms of the group. In this sense, the first comforting stories were also the first exercises in social cohesion, teaching children how to belong while fostering empathy and awareness of others. There is a quiet philosophical elegance in this process. In a world dominated by uncertainty, humans discovered that the act of storytelling itself could create order, meaning, and reassurance. The story was a scaffold, a framework within which fear could be named, examined, and transcended. A predator, a storm, or a sudden darkness became narrative motifs, lessons that could be explored safely within the cave or around the fire. The child experienced these challenges vicariously, their anxiety mitigated by the presence, voice, and attention of the caregiver. Whispered legends also created a rhythm of life, a temporal structure that bridged day and night, waking and sleeping. Stories were told at specific times, around the fire, before rest, during long travels, marking transitions and creating predictability in an otherwise unpredictable world. These rituals imbued stories with power, shaping the emotional and cognitive patterns of the child. Comfort was not incidental, it was intentional, embedded in the very structure of narrative practice. Ultimately, whispered legends reveal something fundamental about humanity, the recognition that emotional well-being, imagination, and learning are inseparable. The first stories told to comfort a child were never merely stories. They were instruments of connection, empathy, and survival. They transformed the raw, chaotic world into something comprehensible, navigable, and emotionally manageable. They established a precedent for all storytelling that followed, a reminder that even in the most primal conditions, humans sought to soothe, to guide, and to inspire through the magic of narrative. In these moments, we see the essence of human creativity and care converging. The child, listening attentively, is not just a passive recipient but an active participant in the evolution of culture. Each gasp, sigh, or smile influences the next telling. Each iteration preserves memory, moral insight, and emotional nuance. And so, through whispered legends, the very foundations of human empathy, imagination, and societal continuity were laid, one carefully chosen word, one gentle pause, one intimate story at a time. Deep within the quiet recesses of prehistoric caves, shadows danced across stone walls as flickering firelight painted fleeting stories in motion. These walls, cool and unyielding, became silent witnesses to the earliest expressions of human imagination. Long before the first words could be written, before ink or pigment or parchment, humans turned to the tactile and visual world to communicate, to teach, and to soothe. The first stories were not only spoken, they were enacted, embodied, and projected onto the stones themselves. Imagine a small group gathered around a central fire, the smoke curling upward and mingling with the earthy scent of the cave. A child sits close to a caregiver, eyes wide and pupils dilated, drawn to the shifting patterns on the wall. The storyteller gestures, moving hands in synchrony with words that describe animals, hunters, or the very elements themselves. The flames exaggerate each movement, casting larger-than-life silhouettes that bring the narrative to a vivid, almost magical reality. In these shadows, the story becomes tangible. It leaps from voice to vision, from imagination to perception. Cave walls provided more than mere surfaces for play. They were the first canvases for human expression. Anthropologists believe that these early illustrations were not mere decoration but functional storytelling tools. Lines and shapes could represent animals, predators, or abstract concepts, reinforcing the lessons embedded in spoken narratives. A predator depicted on stone, for instance, served both as a cautionary guide and as a visual anchor for a tale designed to comfort or instruct a child. The interaction between voice and shadow allowed complex ideas to be communicated even when language itself was still forming. The flickering shadows also carried an emotional resonance. The fire's rhythm created a natural cadence, a pulse that mirrored the storyteller's voice and the child's heartbeat. Shadows lengthened and contracted, appearing to move and breathe in harmony with the tale. This sensory layering amplified the story's impact, fostering attention, wonder, and emotional connection. The child was not merely listening, they were immersed, learning to navigate both fear and delight, guided by visual cues and auditory patterns. Consider the role of imagination in this process. The child's mind, eager and responsive, transformed flat stone into landscapes, animals, and characters. The shadows acted as catalysts, igniting creativity and helping the child visualize scenarios that extended beyond the immediate environment. In doing so, early humans created a safe mental space where danger could be explored and processed without exposure to actual risk. The story became simultaneously a lesson in survival and a rehearsal in emotional regulation. Shadows on stone also served as a bridge between generations. While spoken stories could fade with time or memory, the visual imprint of shapes on walls created a more permanent record. Early humans could return to the same cave, recognizing familiar symbols, recalling previous tales, and passing knowledge onward. These images were intertwined with narrative, creating an early form of multimedia storytelling, an integration of sight, sound, and emotion that engaged both child and adult alike. Even gestures alone carried meaning. The careful movement of hands, the mimicry of animal motions, and the use of space all conveyed subtleties that words could not yet capture. Children learned not only the story itself but the art of attention, observation, and interpretation. By watching shadows and responding to gestures, the young were practicing cognitive skills critical for survival: pattern recognition, spatial awareness, and cause and effect reasoning. Storytelling became both entertainment and education, comforting and instructing simultaneously. There was also an inherent ritualistic quality to these moments. The cave, dim and enclosed, framed the story as a special event, a pause from ordinary activity where attention and emotion were fully engaged. The fire, the walls, the shadows, and the voices together created a temporary sacred space, a microcosm in which fear could be contained and imagination could flourish. Comfort was achieved not merely through words but through atmosphere, ritual, and multisensory immersion. In addition to their instructional and emotional roles, shadows on stone fostered empathy. By seeing exaggerated gestures and visual metaphors, children could grasp complex emotions: fear, joy, surprise, sorrow, projected through the storyteller's performance. The visual component allowed abstract concepts to take form, making experiences tangible and understandable. Through this process, early storytelling cultivated not only survival skills but also emotional intelligence, preparing children for the social and psychological demands of human life. Finally, these early acts of storytelling on stone laid the groundwork for culture itself. They represented humanity's first attempts to externalize imagination, to transform the intangible into tangible form, and to communicate across time and space. In every shadow cast by firelight, we see the merging of practical knowledge, emotional care, and creative expression. The first story told to comfort a child was no longer only in the voice, it now lived in the room, in the dance of light and shadow, in the interplay between storyteller and listener, in the silent lessons etched upon stone. In this way, Shadows on Stone captures a pivotal moment in human history. The convergence of sight, sound, and imagination transformed simple survival strategies into the beginnings of culture, empathy, and creativity. Through flickering shapes and whispered words, children learned to navigate the complexities of existence, to process fear, and to experience wonder. The walls of the cave, silent yet alive, bore witness to the earliest acts of storytelling, echoing across millennia as humanity's first attempt to comfort, instruct, and inspire. The fire crackled and hissed, sending sparks dancing into the dark recesses of the cave. Its warmth pressed against the chill of the early evening, drawing humans closer into its embrace. Around this fire, the first stories to comfort a child were told, not as casual diversions, but as sacred rituals. The circle of light became a stage, a sanctuary, and a bridge between the uncertainty of the outside world and the safety of human presence. Every flicker, every ember, became part of a living, breathing narrative. Imagine a small family huddled together, the child nestled against a caregiver's chest, tiny fingers brushing over coarse fabric and warm skin. The parent's voice rises and falls, gentle yet deliberate, weaving a tale that blends reality with imagination. Each syllable, each pause, each subtle gesture serves a purpose: to soothe, to instruct, and to transport. The child's eyes follow the movements of hands, the undulations of shadow across the walls, the fiery dance of light that turns ordinary stone into landscapes of wonder. The fire itself becomes a character in the story, alive with rhythm and pulse, echoing the cadence of the narrator's voice. These fireside rituals were more than storytelling. They were immersive experiences designed to engage multiple senses at once. The smell of smoke, the warmth against skin, the sound of crackling flames, and the sight of shifting shadows all contributed to a rich tapestry that enveloped the listener. In this multisensory environment, a story became tangible. It could be felt as much as heard. A child's fear of the dark or of distant predators could be softened, reframed, or transformed entirely through the careful orchestration of voice, gesture, and environment. Anthropologists suggest that such rituals were critical in shaping early human cognition and emotional development. Stories told around fires served dual functions. They imparted survival knowledge, where to find food, how to recognize danger, how to cooperate, while also providing psychological comfort. The repetition of certain motifs, the predictability of familiar refrains, and the structured rhythm of storytelling created a sense of order in an otherwise chaotic world. Children internalized lessons while simultaneously feeling secure, enveloped by the warmth and attention of the group. Consider the dynamics between storyteller and child. The parent or caregiver observes the listener closely, adjusting tone, pace, and emphasis in response to subtle cues. A gasp, a smile, a slight lean closer or backward, all feed back into the narrative. This symbiotic relationship ensures that the story is not merely told but experienced. Each ritualistic telling is unique, adapted to the emotional needs of the child in that moment. In this way, early storytelling was both an art and a science, intuitive yet precise, emotional yet structured. Fireside rituals also reinforced social cohesion and collective memory. While the child was the primary recipient of comfort, the story resonated with the entire group. Shared narratives became a form of cultural glue, linking generations through common experiences, motifs, and lessons. The tales preserved memory, of hunts, of migrations, of victories and losses, and embedded emotional resonance within each narrative. Through repeated ritual, children learned to understand not only the practicalities of survival but also the emotional rhythms of their community, trust, empathy, and cooperation. There was a musicality to these stories as well. Voice, gesture, and environment combined to create a subtle rhythm that entranced the listener. Repetition of sounds or phrases, a drawn-out vowel, or the soft hum of accompaniment from stones or sticks provided a soothing auditory framework. The storyteller's voice mirrored the child's internal state, modulating to calm, to excite, or to create suspense. In these early acoustic landscapes, humans discovered that narrative could shape emotion as effectively as content could convey information. The content of these early fireside tales was as diverse as it was functional. Some stories portrayed animals and their cleverness or danger. Others depicted natural phenomena, storms, rivers, earthquakes, as forces to respect and understand. Even supernatural or symbolic elements likely emerged here, in the interplay between imagination and observation. Yet regardless of theme, the stories shared a common purpose: to comfort and to instruct. They created a safe arena where fear could be explored and mastery rehearsed. The child learned to navigate the world not only through observation but through imaginative engagement, guided by the structured rhythm of story. Fireside rituals were also moments of intimacy and attention. In a world of constant vigilance, humans paused to invest time and emotional energy in the young. A single story could extend across minutes or hours, marked by careful pacing, strategic silences, and dramatic gestures. The firelight highlighted faces, accentuated expressions, and drew attention to subtle movements. Every element of the environment contributed to the immersive experience. Comfort was achieved not solely through words but through orchestration, sound, light, warmth, and the attentive presence of a caregiver. Over time, these rituals likely evolved into complex traditions. Certain stories may have been repeated nightly, becoming foundational narratives in a child's early experience. Others were improvised, responding to immediate concerns, a fear of thunder, the sighting of a dangerous animal, the anticipation of a long journey. Flexibility and responsiveness were crucial. Each story was not only a performance but a dialogue, a negotiation between caregiver and child, imagination and reality, fear and reassurance. Perhaps the most profound aspect of these fireside rituals is their universality. Across continents and cultures, across millennia, humans have returned to the same fundamental structure, a protective circle of warmth, a voice attuned to the listener, and stories that comfort, instruct, and inspire. These rituals reveal something essential about humanity, the recognition that emotional care, cognitive development, and cultural continuity are inseparable. The first stories told to comfort a child were not ephemeral amusements, they were deliberate acts of nurturing, teaching, and connecting across generations. In this luminous circle, the child's eyes reflect the fire, the storyteller's expression, and the shadows dancing along the walls. Every flicker, every pause, every carefully chosen word weaves a fabric of safety and understanding. These stories, ephemeral yet enduring, demonstrate the earliest recognition of the profound power of narrative to shape thought, manage emotion, and create connection. Here, in the quiet intimacy of a fireside, humans discovered the delicate alchemy of words, light, and presence, a combination capable of transforming fear into wonder, uncertainty into security, and isolation into shared experience. By participating in these rituals, the child is not merely entertained, they are initiated into the earliest traditions of culture, empathy, and imagination. They learn that stories can protect, guide, and console. They absorb the rhythms of voice and fire, the patterns of narrative and shadow. They are comforted, yes, but they are also prepared, for life, for understanding, for the continuation of human experience. The fireside ritual is thus at once simple and profound, a sanctuary, a classroom, and a stage for the first great experiments in human emotional and cognitive development. Outside the safety of the cave, the world was a place of endless unpredictability. Wind swept through the trees, carrying distant roars and rustling shadows. Predators prowled unseen, and sudden storms could strip warmth and shelter in moments. For the prehistoric child, every sound, every flicker of movement, was a potential threat. Fear, primal and unfiltered, was one of the earliest companions of human life. It was instinctual, necessary, and profoundly shaping. Yet within the circle of firelight, guided by attentive caregivers, fear became something that could be explored, understood, and eventually softened through story. The first stories told to a child were intimately connected to this landscape of danger. Fear was never denied, it was acknowledged, framed, and managed. A predator outside the cave, or the darkness that pressed against its entrance, became the subject of narrative. Through tales, danger was personified, structured, and rendered comprehensible. The storyteller transformed the raw, chaotic world into a manageable set of patterns. A lion became not only a threat but a character, a lesson, a narrative agent whose behavior could be anticipated, and whose danger could be mitigated in the mind before it was encountered in reality. Fear, in these early stories, was a teacher. Children learned to recognize and respond to danger while remaining emotionally grounded. The caregiver's voice acted as a stabilizing force, guiding the child through tension and release, suspense and resolution. A pause at the height of danger, a soothing tone after a climax, and a gentle reminder of safety created a rhythm that mirrored the child's internal state. Stories became rehearsal spaces for emotional resilience. Through narrative, the child could confront fear in a controlled environment, experiencing anxiety safely and learning to process it effectively. Anthropologists argue that this early engagement with fear had critical adaptive value. Humans who could anticipate threats, manage anxiety, and respond with strategy were more likely to survive. Yet the first stories to comfort a child did more than teach survival. They nurtured imagination, empathy, and moral reasoning. The predator in a tale was also a mirror of human behavior, cunning, patient, or powerful. The child learned to navigate relationships, understand motives, and recognize consequences through the same narrative mechanisms that taught about danger in the natural world. The first fear was not only external, it was deeply internal. Darkness, separation from caregivers, sudden noises, or unfamiliar landscapes provoked an emotional response that storytelling could address. In this sense, the stories were bridges between reality and perception, between external threats and internal anxiety. They validated the child's feelings while providing structure and reassurance. The caregiver's presence, combined with narrative and ritual, created a psychological space where fear could be transformed into understanding, wonder, or even delight. Visual elements such as shadows on cave walls or the flicker of firelight amplified the impact of stories. A child's imagination was intensely responsive to these stimuli. Shadows could embody predators, storms, or mythical beings, allowing narrative tension to play out in a controlled, symbolic form. The interplay between light, movement, and voice turned abstract fear into something concrete, navigable, and ultimately manageable. The child learned to anticipate patterns, recognize signals, and differentiate between real and imagined danger. The caregiver's role in this process cannot be overstated. Through intonation, gesture, and timing, the storyteller modeled appropriate responses to fear. A softening of the voice, a guiding hand, or a reassuring look conveyed empathy and security. Each story was calibrated to the child's emotional state, a delicate balance between tension and comfort. The child experienced fear but never abandonment. Through repetition and ritual, the narrative created a predictable arc, suspense, confrontation, and resolution. In this way, the first stories to comfort a child were simultaneously lessons in survival, emotional regulation, and trust. Even in its simplest forms, fear-driven storytelling cultivated imagination. The child learned to project scenarios, anticipate outcomes, and experiment mentally with possible responses. By engaging with fear safely, the mind practiced problem-solving, risk assessment, and creative thinking. The predator in a story became a teacher, the darkness, a canvas, the storm, a narrative challenge to overcome. Through these controlled encounters, the child internalized both caution and confidence, learning to navigate the complexities of life with curiosity and resilience. Fear also provided contrast, a necessary foil to comfort. The tension created by a shadowy figure or a sudden sound heightened the impact of reassurance and warmth. Without the presence of danger, real or imagined, the caregiver's voice, the rhythm of the story, and the light of the fire would have little meaning. It was this delicate interplay between threat and protection that gave early stories their emotional power. The child learned to appreciate safety, to recognize care, and to internalize the subtle cues that signaled security. These early tales of fear were, in essence, proto-myths. They encoded not only survival strategies but also moral and social lessons. Predators were not only dangerous, they were clever, patient, and morally ambiguous, reflecting human qualities and challenges. Children absorbed insights into cooperation, strategy, courage, and empathy. By confronting fear within narrative, they learned the rhythms of human experience, the oscillation between anxiety and relief, danger and protection, uncertainty and understanding. Importantly, the first fear was never endured in isolation. Humans are social creatures, and early storytelling reinforced communal bonds. The presence of caregivers, siblings, and peers amplified the sense of security and shared experience. Children were taught that fear could be faced, navigated, and mitigated with support. The act of storytelling, in this context, was as much about social cohesion as it was about individual comfort. It established early norms of empathy, protection, and collective attention, foundational elements of human society. In this way, the first stories told to comfort a child were acts of both survival and imagination. They acknowledged fear, legitimized emotion, and provided a structured space in which to explore it. They demonstrated that the human mind could transform anxiety into understanding, danger into narrative, and vulnerability into learning. Through the interplay of voice, gesture, shadow, and ritual, the first storytellers taught children the rhythms of life itself, tension and release, danger and protection, fear and comfort. By engaging with the first fear, children were not simply entertained, they were trained in the emotional architecture of humanity. They learned that fear could coexist with safety, that imagination could transform uncertainty into comprehension, and that stories were bridges connecting individual experience to collective wisdom. The first narratives were not ephemeral, they were foundational, shaping the emotional and cognitive development of humans in ways that resonate to this day. And so, within the firelit cave, with shadows dancing across stone and voices rising and falling in cadence, the first fear was confronted and contained. The child experienced anxiety, yes, but also wonder, reassurance, and a growing sense of competence. The first stories to comfort a child were born from this delicate interplay. They were mirrors of the external world, scaffolds for the internal mind, and bridges between generations. In the soft glow of firelight, humanity learned that fear, when acknowledged and guided, could become a teacher, a companion, and a source of profound growth. In the flickering glow of the fire, stories became more than words, they became shields, protective vessels against the unknown. The prehistoric world was filled with threats that could strike without warning: predators, harsh weather, or even the instability of human society itself. For the child, every noise, every shadow, and every sudden change carried the potential for alarm. Within this context, the act of storytelling assumed a profound role. Words, gestures, and rhythmic tones coalesced to form a protective barrier, a narrative armor that allowed the young to navigate fear while feeling held, seen, and understood. Stories functioned as shields on multiple levels. Practically, they transmitted essential survival knowledge. Tales of cunning predators, treacherous landscapes, or rival groups of humans encoded strategies for avoidance and vigilance. The child absorbed these lessons indirectly, learning to anticipate danger without facing it firsthand. Yet the shield was not solely informational, it was emotional. The caregiver's attentive presence, the cadence of voice, and the ritualized gestures surrounding the tale provided reassurance, creating a buffer between anxiety and calm. In essence, the story acted as a medium through which fear could be managed, structured, and contained. Imagine the child leaning close to the caregiver, eyes fixed on dancing shadows that echo the tale's content. The story might describe a wolf stalking silently, a river overflowing unpredictably, or a storm that reshapes the landscape. Each narrative element carries weight, suspense heightens attention, repetition reinforces memory, and resolution provides relief. In this delicate interplay, the child's mind internalizes both caution and security. The narrative shield is simultaneously a rehearsal for real-world dangers and a comforting embrace, a dual function that is both protective and nurturing. Anthropologists suggest that this dual function was critical for human evolution. Survival depended not only on physical capabilities but also on cognitive and emotional flexibility. Early humans who could anticipate threats, regulate anxiety, and respond adaptively were more likely to thrive. By embedding survival knowledge within stories, caregivers created a cognitive scaffold that allowed children to practice mental rehearsal safely. Fear was acknowledged but structured, uncertainty was present but manageable. The story became an adaptive tool, a shield forged from imagination, attention, and emotional attunement. The visual dimension of storytelling enhanced this protective effect. Firelight cast shadows on the cave walls, animating the narrative in real time. Shadows could mimic predators, topography, or even human figures, turning abstract danger into something perceivable and therefore navigable. The child learned to map experience symbolically, translating observation into comprehension. Imagination became a form of preparation, allowing the mind to anticipate, rehearse, and strategize. In this way, stories as shields were both cognitive and emotional training, simultaneously strengthening intellect and resilience. Ritualized repetition reinforced the protective power of narrative. Certain stories may have been told nightly, following predictable rhythms that created emotional stability. The caregiver's voice, familiar and attuned, provided continuity. Even when the content of the story involved danger or suspense, the predictable structure offered reassurance. The child came to understand that, despite external threats, there was a safe space within which to engage with fear. The story acted as both map and refuge, a framework for exploring and mastering the unknown. Stories as shields also cultivated empathy and social intelligence. Tales often included characters, both human and animal, whose actions and motivations required interpretation. The child learned to recognize patterns of behavior, anticipate outcomes, and understand emotional states. This early practice in perspective-taking laid the foundation for cooperative behavior, social cohesion, and moral reasoning. The narrative shield was thus not only protective of the individual but formative for the community, preparing children to navigate social and environmental complexities alike. The emotional cadence of storytelling further reinforced its protective role. Rising tension, strategic pauses, and gentle resolutions created a rhythm that mirrored the child's internal emotional state. Caregivers instinctively modulated these elements, amplifying suspense or providing reassurance as needed. The story was thus interactive. The child's reactions influenced the telling, and the narrative, in turn, shaped the child's emotional experience. This dynamic ensured that the shield was responsive, adaptive, and deeply attuned to the needs of the listener. Even the content of the story was carefully calibrated to serve as a shield. Predators might be depicted not only as threats but also as agents of learning, curiosity, or cunning. The child was introduced to the idea that danger could be observed, anticipated, and managed. Natural phenomena such as floods, storms, or fire were rendered comprehensible through narrative, reducing anxiety and fostering agency. In all cases, the story transformed abstract or overwhelming threats into structured, manageable experiences. The communal dimension of these protective stories cannot be overlooked. Fireside storytelling often involved multiple generations, linking the child not only to caregivers but also to siblings, elders, and peers. Collective participation reinforced safety and connection, creating a shared sense of vigilance and care. Stories acted as communal shields, encoding knowledge and emotional resilience across the group. The child absorbed both the content and the social rhythms, learning how to engage with fear in the context of relationships and collective attention. Through repeated exposure to stories as shields, children developed resilience. They learned to navigate fear with guidance, to anticipate and plan, and to internalize emotional regulation. These early narratives created a psychological infrastructure that extended beyond the immediate moment of storytelling. The child carried lessons forward, applying both practical strategies and emotional tools in interactions with the natural world and the human community. The first stories were thus both protective and formative, shaping the architecture of mind, emotion, and social cognition. Stories as shields also illuminate a profound philosophical insight. Narrative itself is a mechanism of survival. Words, rhythm, and imagination collectively forge a cognitive and emotional tool capable of containing fear, cultivating insight, and fostering connection. Through these stories, early humans discovered that knowledge is inseparable from empathy, that understanding is inseparable from care, and that emotional resilience is inseparable from communal and cultural practices. The narrative shield is, in essence, a reflection of what it means to be human, to imagine, to protect, to nurture, and to teach. In the quiet glow of the fire, with shadows dancing along stone walls, the child experiences fear yet remains protected. The storyteller's voice, gestures, and attentiveness form an invisible barrier that transforms anxiety into comprehension, danger into structured experience, and uncertainty into confidence. This delicate interplay of narrative, emotion, and attention illustrates the earliest recognition of storytelling as a tool not only for entertainment or instruction but also for emotional survival. By understanding stories as shields, we see the profound continuity between ancient and modern human experience. From the first firelit cave to contemporary bedtime rituals, humans have used narrative to create safety, structure, and understanding. The first stories told to comfort a child were protective acts, carefully calibrated performances designed to nurture resilience, curiosity, and trust. They are, in every sense, humanity's earliest armor, forged not from metal or stone, but from voice, imagination, and empathetic connection. Amid the flickering firelight, the human voice became a thread, connecting child and caregiver, reality and imagination, fear and comfort. The first stories were often sung or intoned with musical cadence, a natural rhythm that resonated deep within the child's nervous system. These early songs were not merely decorative, they were functional, shaping attention, regulating emotion, and reinforcing memory. The caregiver's song was an instrument of solace, a melody that could soothe trembling limbs, quiet racing thoughts, and transform anxiety into trust. Music and rhythm have always been integral to human experience, but in the prehistoric cave they assumed a vital role in caregiving. A simple pattern of rising and falling pitch, soft humming, or gentle repetition created a predictable auditory environment. The child could anticipate the rise and fall of each phrase, each intonation, and with this anticipation came a sense of control. In a world governed by unpredictability, the caregiver's song offered stability, a consistent pattern amid chaos. The fire, the shadows, and the melodic voice combined to produce an immersive sanctuary of comfort. Consider the physical and emotional impact of these songs. The vibrations of the voice traveled through air and often through the close contact of skin and body. The warmth of a caregiver's embrace amplified this effect, creating a multisensory experience that combined touch, sound, and attention. A child listening to a rhythmic narrative or song experienced more than storytelling. They experienced a direct transmission of safety. Each note, each pause, each melodic inflection was carefully modulated, whether consciously or intuitively, to convey reassurance and presence. The caregiver's song also served as an emotional primer. Stories imbued with melody allowed children to process feelings more effectively than words alone. Joy, sorrow, fear, and relief were encoded in the voice, teaching emotional literacy long before formal language existed. A rising pitch might signify excitement or danger, while a slow, gentle cadence signaled safety and closure. By engaging with these auditory cues, children learned to recognize, anticipate, and regulate emotional states. The song became a map, guiding the mind through the terrain of feelings and experiences. Even the simplest melodies could encode complex lessons. Anthropologists suggest that early songs often incorporated repetition, rhyme, and rhythm to enhance memorization and comprehension. Patterns embedded within the song help children retain crucial survival information, the behaviors of predators, the rhythm of tides, or the locations of safe shelters. At the same time, the melodic structure offered comfort, creating predictability and trust. In this way, the caregiver's song functioned simultaneously as a tool for emotional regulation, memory, and education. The social dimension of these songs was equally profound. The act of singing or intoning stories around a fire reinforced bonds within the family or group. Children learned to synchronize their attention, respond to cues, and participate in shared emotional experience. Even as passive listeners, they absorbed lessons about cooperation, empathy, and communal vigilance. The song transformed storytelling from a solitary activity into a shared ritual, strengthening social cohesion and transmitting both knowledge and emotional intelligence across generations. Imagination thrived within these melodic frameworks. The rise and fall of voice, punctuated by pauses or gestures, allowed children to visualize scenes with enhanced clarity. Predators became tangible, storms were dramatized, and natural landscapes were rendered vivid through auditory scaffolding. Melody and narrative merged to create a sensory-rich experience that expanded the mind's capacity for symbolic thought. The first caregivers' songs were, in essence, exercises in imagination, cognitive rehearsal, and emotional processing, simultaneously comforting and preparing the child for the realities of the world. There is also a rhythmical, almost meditative quality to these early songs. As the melody flowed, the child's breathing, heart rate, and attention naturally synchronized with the caregiver's voice. This entrainment created a subtle physiological regulation, reducing stress and fostering a sense of calm. In essence, the caregiver's song transformed the child's internal state, creating an experiential space where fear could be acknowledged and softened, curiosity could flourish, and trust could deepen. The song was both protective and formative, shaping body, mind, and emotion in ways that words alone could not achieve. The content of these songs often mirrored the lessons embedded in spoken stories. Predators, natural phenomena, and social interactions were dramatized and emphasized through melodic variation. The song could elevate tension to highlight danger or soften tone to signal resolution and safety. The musicality of the caregiver's voice amplified the narrative's impact, reinforcing survival knowledge while simultaneously creating emotional resonance. The child learned not only the facts of the world but also the emotional rhythms of living within it. Caregiver songs were also adaptable, responsive to the child's needs and reactions. A sudden whimper, a shift in posture, or a widening of eyes could prompt the singer to modulate tempo, pitch, or volume. This interactive dynamic ensured that the song was not static, it was attuned to real-time emotional states. In this way, the first caregiver songs were intuitive instruments of empathy, designed to respond to and shape the listener's experience while maintaining the dual functions of instruction and comfort. The longevity and universality of these practices highlight their profound significance. Across cultures and epochs, humans have relied on song as a tool for comfort, teaching, and emotional regulation. The first caregiver songs represent the origins of this tradition, illustrating a fundamental truth, that narrative, rhythm, and melody are inseparable from the human capacity to nurture, empathize, and transmit knowledge. In these songs we see the intersection of survival, culture, and emotional care, a triad that defines humanity itself. Finally, the caregiver's song illustrates the delicate interplay between fear and reassurance, danger and protection. Within its melodic arcs, the child encounters simulated threats, emotional tension, and resolution. The song transforms abstract fear into structured narrative, rendering the unknown intelligible and manageable. It is both shield and scaffold, providing a safe framework for understanding the world, internalizing emotional lessons, and cultivating imagination. In these earliest musical narratives, the roots of culture, empathy, and cognitive development converge. In the fire-lit circle, with shadows flickering across the walls, the child listens, absorbs, and participates. Each note, each rhythmic gesture, each melodic inflection transmits a legacy of care, intelligence, and creativity. The caregiver's song is a living thread, connecting generations, a bridge between the immediate and the enduring, between fear and comfort. It is in this intimate interplay that we witness the first conscious acts of emotional nurturing through narrative, the moment when the human mind discovered that song could teach, heal, and protect. Through the caregiver's song, children learned the rhythms of life, the balance between tension and relief, danger and safety, uncertainty and trust. These early musical narratives shaped cognition, fostered imagination, and cultivated emotional resilience, establishing patterns that would resonate through all subsequent human storytelling. The song is, in essence, the heartbeat of early civilization, a subtle yet powerful force that transformed fear into understanding, vulnerability into learning, and the solitary child into a participant in a larger, caring human world. Deep within the cave, where shadows stretched long across stone walls and the fire's glow cast flickering silhouettes, the child's mind began to roam freely. Darkness, once a source of fear, became a canvas for imagination. The absence of visual certainty encouraged mental projection, allowing the young to fill gaps with creativity, curiosity, and wonder. In this interplay of light and shadow, the first stories told to comfort a child found their richest expression. Imagination thrived in the dark, transforming anxiety into exploration and the unknown into a landscape for thought, learning, and emotional growth. The cave environment itself encouraged cognitive expansion. Limited visibility forced the child to rely on memory, pattern recognition, and predictive thinking. Every flicker of shadow or movement in peripheral vision demanded interpretation. Here, imagination was not frivolous, it was practical. The child mentally rehearsed scenarios, predicted outcomes, and visualized dangers and solutions, all under the guiding framework of the storyteller's narrative. The darkness became both a teacher and a playground, fostering adaptive thinking long before formal education existed. Consider the role of shadows in stimulating creative cognition. Firelight projected moving shapes that could resemble animals, natural formations, or human figures. The child's mind, hungry for meaning, wove these shapes into coherent stories, predators lurking in the flicker, rivers forming from shadowy angles, and mountains rising from the contours of the cave walls all became elements in an emergent mental narrative. Imagination did not merely embellish reality, it structured it, providing tools for understanding and interacting with a complex and unpredictable world. The interplay between fear and creativity was especially important. Dark spaces naturally provoke anxiety, but storytelling and shadow play transformed this anxiety into an opportunity for imaginative engagement. The child learned that mental exploration could coexist with emotional regulation. Danger was acknowledged and symbolically represented, but it was contained within the narrative. The mind could venture into the unknown, practice responses, and develop resilience, all while remaining within the protective embrace of the caregiver and the fire-lit circle. Stories in the dark also honed abstract thinking. The child began to differentiate between literal and symbolic, immediate and potential, real and imagined. A shadow that represented a predator in one story could, in another, symbolize a natural phenomenon or a moral lesson. These exercises in mental flexibility laid the foundation for sophisticated cognitive abilities, hypothesis testing, pattern recognition, problem-solving, and moral reasoning. Early imagination was deeply intertwined with both survival and social learning. Anthropologists suggest that these dark, firelit storytelling sessions were crucial for the development of narrative intelligence, the ability to understand sequences, causality, and the intentions of others. Imagination in the dark allowed children to explore cause and effect relationships, anticipate outcomes, and internalize lessons in both social and natural contexts. By engaging with shadows and stories simultaneously, the child cultivated an early form of what we now call theory of mind, the capacity to predict, interpret, and empathize with the behavior of others. The sensory richness of the cave amplified this effect. Flickering firelight, the smell of smoke, the sound of crackling wood, and the tactile sensation of sitting close to the caregiver created a multisensory environment that enhanced cognitive processing. The child's attention was fully engaged, oscillating between sensory input, narrative comprehension, and imaginative projection. This immersive experience strengthened memory, reinforced emotional regulation, and nurtured creativity, illustrating how early humans integrated multiple cognitive faculties into a single, holistic learning moment. Interaction with the storyteller further enriched imaginative capacities. The caregiver's gestures, facial expressions, and vocal inflections guided attention and suggested interpretive frameworks. Subtle cues, pointing to a shadow, pausing before a climactic moment, varying vocal pitch, provided scaffolding for the child's creative engagement. Imagination was nurtured, not left to chance. The child learned to connect symbolic representation with lived experience, translating abstract or ambiguous forms into meaningful mental constructs. Even the child's own contributions mattered. Questions, gestures, or vocal reactions were integrated into the ongoing narrative, creating a dialogic dynamic. Imagination became collaborative. The child co-created aspects of the story alongside the caregiver, experimenting with ideas, scenarios, and interpretations. These early co-creative exercises laid the groundwork for complex social cognition, linguistic skill, and cultural participation. The first stories were never purely top-down instruction, they were interactive laboratories for mental growth. In addition to cognitive development, imagination in the dark had profound emotional benefits. By projecting fears and desires into symbolic forms, children could explore emotional complexity in a safe context. Monsters, predators, and natural hazards were no longer sources of paralyzing fear, they became elements of narrative, manipulable, interpretable, and eventually manageable. The dark cave was a stage on which emotional literacy could emerge, preparing children to navigate both the inner and outer worlds with flexibility and confidence. These experiences also fostered empathy. By imagining the perspectives of characters in stories, whether animal, human, or elemental, the child learned to understand motives, predict behavior, and practice compassion. Early imagination was inseparable from social cognition, the mind trained not only for survival but also for the complexities of human interaction. Storytelling in darkness provided a safe, emotionally rich environment in which these skills could flourish. Finally, imagination in the dark demonstrates the profound interplay between environment, narrative, and mind. The cave, the fire, the shadows, and the caregiver's presence collectively created a context in which learning was deeply embodied and multisensory. Fear and curiosity were balanced, cognition and emotion intertwined, and imagination became a tool for both comfort and preparation. The first stories told to comfort a child were thus more than entertainment, they were immersive exercises in thought, feeling, and survival, shaping minds capable of understanding both the world and themselves. In this interplay of shadow, sound, and human presence, we see the birth of a defining human capacity, the ability to transform uncertainty into exploration, anxiety into creativity, and the unknown into a space for learning. Imagination in the dark was a foundational act of cognitive and emotional development. It prepared children for a complex, unpredictable world while embedding within them the earliest lessons of culture, empathy, and resilience. Through these fire-lit, shadow-draped moments, the first storytellers demonstrated that darkness was not merely absence, but potential for thought, growth, understanding, and comfort. The child, guided by voice, shadow, and melody, learned to navigate fear and possibility simultaneously. The cave became a laboratory for the mind, the fire a teacher, and imagination the bridge between vulnerability and empowerment. In the quiet, attentive darkness, the earliest narratives to comfort a child were realized in their most powerful form, immersive, transformative, and profoundly human. As the flickering firelight illuminated the faces of both child and caregiver, something extraordinary was taking shape, the early stirrings of empathy. The first stories told to comfort a child were never solely about survival or fear, they were profoundly relational. Through narrative, the child learned to recognize the feelings of others, to understand intentions, and to anticipate emotional responses. In this quiet circle, empathy was not taught abstractly, it was lived, felt, and absorbed. Consider the way a caregiver modulates tone and expression while telling a story. A soft sigh, a furrowed brow, or a smile conveys emotional context that words alone cannot carry. The child perceives these cues and begins to associate them with internal states, both of the storyteller and of the characters in the narrative. A story of a hunted animal, a lost child, or a fellow tribe member in danger becomes a vehicle for emotional understanding. The child learns to feel alongside the character, to imagine their fears, desires, and struggles, and to internalize responses that are socially and emotionally appropriate. Anthropologists argue that these early narrative interactions were critical for the evolution of social cognition. Humans are inherently cooperative creatures, and the ability to anticipate the feelings and actions of others confers a significant adaptive advantage. The first stories created a safe context in which children could practice this skill. By empathizing with characters in tales, human or animal, the child rehearsed perspective-taking, problem-solving, and moral reasoning. Empathy was being cultivated not through abstract instruction, but through immersive, emotionally resonant experience. The emotional rhythm of storytelling amplified this effect. Rising tension, suspenseful pauses, and moments of resolution mirrored real-life emotional arcs. The child experienced fear, relief, sadness, or joy in a structured, predictable context guided by the caregiver's voice and presence. Through repeated exposure, children learn to modulate their own emotional responses, develop patience, and recognize the emotional states of others. Empathy, then, was inseparable from both emotional intelligence and cognitive development. Physical proximity and touch further reinforced empathic learning. The warmth of a caregiver's embrace, the gentle brushing of hands, or a responsive gesture during a tense moment created a multisensory link between narrative and emotional understanding. Comfort and attention were intertwined with story content. The child's internal state synchronized with the external cues, fostering an embodied experience of empathy. Emotional understanding was not a distant concept, it was a felt reality, integrated with memory, imagination, and sensory perception. Stories often depicted complex social interactions that required interpretation. Characters might act selfishly, bravely, cunningly, or compassionately, and the child observed the consequences of these actions. Through narrative, children learned to recognize intentions, predict behavior, and evaluate ethical choices. Early storytelling served as a rehearsal for social life, teaching lessons about cooperation, fairness, risk, and trust. By navigating these scenarios in imagination, children could prepare for real-world interactions with enhanced emotional acuity. The first stories also illustrated the consequences of action and inaction. A tale of a predator avoided through cooperation, a lost child rescued through vigilance, or a tribe that survived through empathy and mutual aid reinforced moral and social lessons. Children learned that emotions were not isolated, they had consequences for others. Empathy, then, became both a cognitive and social tool, allowing young humans to anticipate, understand, and influence the feelings and behaviors of those around them. Shadow play and firelight magnified the impact of these empathic lessons. As figures flickered across walls, the child could imagine scenarios more vividly, enhancing emotional engagement. The interplay of light and dark amplified tension and relief, making the narrative experience visceral. The child learned not only the facts of danger or social rules but also the emotional texture of human experience. These early immersive environments cultivated sensitivity, moral reasoning, and a capacity for imaginative projection that would become foundational to human society. Empathy in early stories was not confined to human characters. Animals were often anthropomorphized, given intentions, emotions, and agency. The child learned to recognize needs, desires, and struggles in non-human entities, developing a broader, more inclusive sense of care. By imagining the predator's cunning, the prey's fear, or the cooperative efforts of a group of animals, children honed emotional insight and the capacity to respond with understanding to diverse beings. This early moral imagination laid the groundwork for ethical reasoning and the complex social bonds that define humanity. The caregiver's responsiveness played a critical role in shaping empathy. Observing and reacting to the child's emotional cues, the storyteller reinforced appropriate emotional engagement. A gasp, a laugh, or a gesture might elicit modulation in tone or emphasis, creating a feedback loop between experience and narrative. Empathy was co-constructed, practiced, and internalized within the relational context of storytelling. The child learned that emotions could be shared, negotiated, and reflected in others, forming the roots of social intelligence. Moreover, empathy cultivated through storytelling enhanced resilience. Children learned that fear, sadness, or uncertainty could be endured, understood, and shared. The narrative provided a safe framework for experiencing complex emotions, allowing the child to explore vulnerability without harm. Understanding the feelings of characters, and, by extension, others in real life, equipped children with the capacity to respond adaptively to emotional challenges, fostering emotional regulation alongside moral awareness. Through repeated rituals of firelit storytelling, empathy became embedded in the structure of the mind. Children internalized emotional patterns, recognizing the universality of feelings, the impact of actions, and the interdependence of individuals within a community. These early practices were more than entertainment or instruction, they were foundational experiences in social and emotional development, shaping the capacity for compassion, cooperation, and moral reasoning that defines humanity. The birth of empathy also marked a turning point in human cultural evolution. By practicing understanding through story, children were prepared to participate fully in communal life. They learned that their actions affected others, that emotions were interconnected, and that moral choices carried consequences. Storytelling became a conduit through which culture, ethical reasoning, and emotional intelligence were transmitted across generations. In this way, the first narratives to comfort a child were simultaneously acts of care and acts of cultural continuity. Finally, empathy in early storytelling illustrates the profound intertwining of emotion, cognition, and sociality. The child learns not only to navigate fear or survive danger, but also to understand, share, and respond to the emotional states of others. This capacity for empathy is foundational to human society, enabling cooperation, conflict resolution, and collective resilience. The first stories were, in essence, laboratories for the mind and the heart, cultivating the emotional sophistication necessary for life within the tribe and, ultimately, for the evolution of complex human culture. In the firelit circle, with shadows stretching and retreating, the child listens, feels, and begins to inhabit the emotional world of others. The caregiver's voice, gestures, and presence provide guidance and support, transforming fear and uncertainty into understanding and compassion. Through these early experiences, the child internalizes the rhythms of empathy, the architecture of moral reasoning, and the interplay between personal emotion and communal life. The first stories to comfort a child were thus far more than tales. They were acts of relational and cultural creation, shaping the human heart as profoundly as they shaped the human mind. In the dim glow of the cave, shadows danced across the rough stone walls, forming shapes that seemed both familiar and mysterious. Within this shifting tapestry, the child's mind absorbed lessons without the need for explicit instruction. The first stories to comfort a child were embedded in these shadows, intertwining narrative, environment, and imagination to create a multi-layered learning experience. Danger, morality, empathy, and survival knowledge were all encoded in the interplay between light and dark, story and observer, creating a subtle but powerful framework for understanding the world. Shadows themselves acted as extensions of the story. A flickering silhouette might represent a predator, a river, a mountain, or even an imagined being. The child's imagination filled in gaps, making the narrative come alive in a tangible, visual form. By interpreting these shadows, children learn to recognize patterns, anticipate outcomes, and connect abstract concepts with real-world consequences. This early form of experiential learning allowed complex lessons to be internalized intuitively, blending cognition with emotion and perception. Consider a story of a hunt. The predator's shadow stretches across the wall, the firelight casting tension and suspense. The caregiver's voice rises, emphasizing danger, then softens as safety is achieved through cunning or cooperation. The child watches, anticipates, and mentally rehearses the events. Through shadow and story, lessons about vigilance, strategy, and the importance of attentiveness are absorbed. The visual, auditory, and emotional elements reinforce one another, ensuring that knowledge is both deeply felt and memorably encoded. These lessons were not limited to survival. Morality, social norms, and communal values were equally woven into the narrative fabric. A tale might depict selfishness leading to failure, or cooperation resulting in success. Shadows allowed these lessons to take on a living form, demonstrating consequences in a visceral, memorable way. The child begins to understand not only what actions are effective, but also what actions are desirable within a social context. Story and shadow together become tools of cultural transmission, shaping cognition, behavior, and ethical understanding. The subtlety of these lessons is crucial. Children were not lectured, they discovered meaning through observation, imagination, and emotional resonance. Shadows offered ambiguity, requiring the mind to interpret and engage actively. This interpretive process encouraged critical thinking, foresight, and problem-solving. The child learns not through passive reception, but through active participation, experimenting mentally with scenarios, predicting outcomes, and drawing conclusions. Lessons woven in shadows were both experiential and participatory, integrating multiple levels of cognition. Anthropologists note that this method of teaching aligns with broader principles of human learning. Observation, imitation, and narrative scaffolding are fundamental to skill acquisition, cultural knowledge, and emotional development. The cave environment, combined with firelight and storytelling, created a rich immersive space where children could practice these cognitive and emotional skills safely. Lessons were reinforced not through repetition alone, but through multisensory, emotionally resonant engagement. Shadows became mirrors of the mind, reflecting and shaping understanding simultaneously. The emotional dimension of shadow-based lessons was equally significant. Shadows dramatized tension, risk, and relief, allowing children to experience emotions within a structured, contained environment. Fear, curiosity, excitement, and empathy were all heightened through the interplay of darkness, narrative, and attention. Children learned to recognize, modulate, and respond to these feelings, developing emotional intelligence alongside cognitive skills. The first stories were not merely entertainment, they were laboratories for emotional development, preparing children to navigate complex social and environmental landscapes. Repetition and ritual reinforced these lessons. Certain stories, told nightly or at predictable times, created a rhythm that children came to expect. Predictable structure offered reassurance, while the content provided challenge and engagement. Shadows enhanced this rhythm, turning the abstract into something tangible. Children internalized patterns of behavior, moral principles, and strategies for survival, embedding them deeply in memory. This repeated engagement ensured that lessons were durable, resilient, and transferable to real-life situations. Lessons woven in shadows also fostered imagination and creativity. By leaving gaps for interpretation, caregivers encouraged children to fill in the narrative themselves, projecting ideas, emotions, and solutions onto the visual canvas. The child learns not only what to think, but also how to think, developing flexible cognitive strategies and imaginative capacities. Shadow play was both a medium for instruction and a catalyst for creative exploration, nurturing mental agility and resourcefulness. Social cognition was deeply entwined with these shadow-based lessons. Stories often involved interactions between multiple characters, whether human, animal, or mythic. The child observed motives, intentions, and consequences, learning to anticipate behavior and respond adaptively. By engaging with narrative in this dynamic visual context, children developed empathy, perspective-taking, and moral reasoning. Shadows allowed abstract social principles to be dramatized, making them accessible and emotionally resonant. The child learned to navigate social complexity long before formal social rules were articulated. The environment itself shaped the lesson. Flickering firelight and irregular cave walls created unpredictability, requiring constant attention and adaptation. Children learn to observe carefully, interpret cues, and integrate multiple sources of information simultaneously. Shadow and story merged into an immersive educational system, blending sensory, cognitive, and emotional learning in a unified experience. The child's mind became attuned to patterns, rhythms, and relationships, laying the foundation for complex reasoning, creativity, and foresight. Caregivers acted as guides through this process. By emphasizing certain shadows, modulating voice, or adding gestures, they highlighted key lessons and emotional cues. The child learned to interpret these signals, gradually internalizing the principles being demonstrated. Guidance was subtle, intuitive, and deeply responsive to the child's reactions. Lessons were embedded in experience rather than explicitly stated, fostering independence, insight, and internal motivation to understand. Even danger itself became instructive. The unpredictability of shadows and movement introduced uncertainty, allowing children to practice problem-solving, anticipation, and risk assessment. By engaging with simulated challenges in a controlled environment, children developed resilience and confidence. The cave became a safe laboratory in which imagination, observation, and experience converged to teach life skills that were both practical and moral. In essence, lessons woven in shadows illustrate the profound interplay between environment, narrative, and cognition. Firelight, darkness, and storytelling created a medium in which knowledge, morality, and emotional intelligence could be transmitted simultaneously. Children learned to observe, imagine, empathize, and reason, all within a space that was both protective and challenging. Shadows were not merely visual phenomena, they were conduits for understanding, shaping minds, hearts, and social awareness. By the end of each story session, the child had navigated a landscape of knowledge, emotion, and imagination. Lessons embedded in the shadows became internalized, forming patterns of thought and behavior that would guide future interactions with the natural and social world. These early narratives were far more than comfort, they were tools of survival, cultural transmission, and emotional development. In the quiet, firelit cave, humanity's first educational system emerged, subtle, immersive, and profoundly effective. Within the protective circle of firelight, storytelling was never merely spontaneous. It followed patterns, rhythms, and gestures that became rituals of reassurance. The first stories told to comfort a child were embedded within these carefully structured routines, offering predictability, emotional safety, and cognitive scaffolding. Repetition, timing, and ritualized performance transformed narrative from mere entertainment into a mechanism for emotional regulation, learning, and bonding. In these rituals, fear could be acknowledged, anxiety could be contained, and the child could experience the world safely while absorbing lessons essential for survival and socialization. Rituals of reassurance often began long before the story itself. The caregiver's preparation, arranging the fire, positioning the child, or even selecting the subject of the tale, signaled the transition from ordinary activity to a dedicated time of learning and comfort. These cues created a predictable framework, allowing the child to anticipate safety and attention. This predictability was essential in a prehistoric world rife with uncertainty. The very act of entering the ritual space conveyed stability, demonstrating to the child that, despite external dangers, a zone of security and guidance existed. Repetition played a central role in these rituals. Stories were often told nightly or at key times during the day, following a consistent structure. Certain phrases, melodies, or gestures would recur, forming patterns the child could recognize and internalize. Repetition reinforced both content and emotional regulation. Narrative lessons became familiar, suspense was tempered by predictable resolution, and emotional engagement was strengthened through consistent rhythm. Ritualized storytelling thus became a powerful tool for memory, comprehension, and psychological resilience. The caregiver's voice, carefully modulated, further enhanced reassurance. Rising tones, pauses, soft hums, and deliberate emphasis created an emotional rhythm that guided the child through fear, curiosity, and resolution. These vocal patterns were subtle yet profound. They communicated safety, attention, and care even as the narrative traversed suspenseful or frightening scenarios. Emotional guidance was embedded within the performance, allowing the child to navigate complex feelings while experiencing consistent support and attunement. Physical gestures were equally integral to the ritual. A hand placed gently on the child's shoulder, a guiding finger toward a shadow, or an embracing posture during tense moments reinforced the lessons of the story. The integration of touch and narrative amplified emotional security, creating a multisensory experience in which comfort was both felt and understood. These gestures also provided cues for interpreting the story, helping the child navigate meaning while remaining anchored in safety. Rituals of reassurance were not only protective but educational. Embedded within these routines were lessons about the natural world, social norms, and survival strategies. The structured repetition allowed children to internalize these lessons deeply, integrating knowledge with emotional and sensory experience. Predators, natural phenomena, and moral dilemmas were all explored in a safe, predictable context. Ritual provided a scaffold, ensuring that learning occurred alongside comfort, attention, and engagement. The fire itself was part of the ritual. Its presence, warmth, and flickering light created a sensory environment conducive to both emotional regulation and imaginative engagement. Shadows animated the narrative, highlighting dangers, illustrating lessons, and engaging the child's mind in problem-solving and imagination. The fire became a participant in the ritual, a silent teacher that amplified the story's impact while reinforcing the child's sense of security. Timing was also critical. Stories might occur at dusk, when the day's activities concluded and external threats became more pronounced. The ritualized timing provided a natural rhythm for the child's emotional and cognitive processes, creating boundaries between daily experience and the immersive world of narrative and imagination. Predictable timing reinforced trust. The child learned that reassurance would be available at certain moments, embedding a sense of safety and reliability. These rituals extended beyond individual storytelling. When multiple children or family members participated, a collective rhythm emerged. Group attention synchronized emotional engagement, and shared reaction strengthened communal bonds and social cohesion. The ritual became a microcosm of social life, teaching cooperation, empathy, and shared vigilance. Children absorbed not only the narrative but also the social dynamics, learning to interpret and respond to cues from peers and elders alike. Imagination was enhanced through ritualized repetition. By anticipating familiar patterns and responding to predictable cues, the child could explore variations in the story, test hypotheses, and engage creatively with content. The ritual framework provided safety while fostering innovation, allowing children to experiment mentally without fear of negative consequences. This balance of stability and flexibility was critical for cognitive and emotional development, encouraging both learning and resilience. Even the caregiver's choice of story contributed to reassurance. Tales were selected and adapted based on the child's needs, emotional state, and developmental stage. A frightening story could be softened with familiar patterns, soothing gestures, or melodic intonation. Conversely, a story emphasizing problem-solving or bravery might challenge the child in controlled ways, fostering growth alongside comfort. The caregiver's intuitive adaptation ensured that the ritual remained responsive, dynamic, and deeply attuned to the child's inner world. Rituals also reinforced cultural transmission. Stories, patterns, and gestures were repeated across generations, embedding communal values, knowledge, and emotional practices within the child. By participating in these rituals, children became carriers of cultural continuity, learning not only facts and survival strategies, but also the rhythms of communal life, moral principles, and emotional intelligence. The ritualized story session was thus a crucible for both individual and collective development. The psychological impact of ritualized storytelling was profound. By providing a predictable, emotionally attuned framework, these rituals reduced anxiety, fostered resilience, and strengthened the child's capacity to navigate uncertainty. Emotional responses were regulated through a combination of narrative, rhythm, gesture, and presence, creating an integrated learning experience. The ritual became a safe arena in which the child could confront fear, practice empathy, and explore imagination while remaining secure and supported. Ultimately, rituals of reassurance illustrate the deeply human capacity to structure experience, embed learning, and cultivate emotional intelligence. The first stories to comfort a child were not isolated acts of narration. They were embedded in patterned, multisensory, and socially rich practices that supported growth, survival, and connection. Through these rituals, children internalized lessons about the natural world, social dynamics, and emotional navigation, all within the protective, comforting framework of predictable structure and attentive care. As firelight danced and shadows shifted, the child emerged from the ritual not only soothed but also prepared. Knowledge, empathy, imagination, and emotional resilience were intertwined, reinforced by repeated, predictable patterns that provided safety and stability. The ritualized story became both a shield and a scaffold, allowing the child to explore the world's complexity while remaining deeply connected to caregiver, community, and self. The first rituals of reassurance were thus far more than narrative. They were foundational acts of care, education, and cultural preservation. Within the firelit circle, the child was more than a passive listener. They were a witness, an observer, a participant, and a learner in the intricate interplay of story, environment, and human presence. To witness the first stories was to engage with the world at multiple levels simultaneously, emotionally, cognitively, and socially. The child absorbed patterns of behavior, moral lessons, and survival strategies while also internalizing the emotional rhythms of those around them. Witnessing was active, immersive, and profoundly transformative. Being a witness in these early storytelling contexts meant observing not only the narrative but also the reactions of the caregiver and others in the group. Facial expressions, gestures, pauses, and tonal shifts were all carefully attended to. The child learned to read subtle cues, anticipate developments, and understand the emotional landscape of the storyteller and community. This early attunement to human behavior fostered social intelligence, laying the groundwork for empathy, cooperation, and nuanced interpersonal understanding. The act of witnessing also shaped imagination. Shadows flickering on the cave walls, amplified by the voice of the caregiver, became dynamic stimuli for mental projection. The child's mind constructed detailed scenarios, anticipated outcomes, and experimented with solutions to challenges presented in the story. Witnessing was therefore not passive absorption but a cognitive exercise. The child was constantly interpreting, predicting, and integrating sensory, emotional, and narrative information. These mental processes strengthened reasoning, creativity, and problem-solving skills long before formal education existed. The child as witness also served as a participant in emotional co-regulation. By observing the caregiver's responses to danger, suspense, or resolution, the child learned how to modulate their own emotional reactions. A rise in vocal tension signaled caution, while a softening tone signaled safety. Through repeated exposure, children developed the ability to anticipate emotional cues, regulate anxiety, and respond adaptively to novel or threatening situations. Witnessing became a training ground for emotional intelligence, teaching children how to navigate their internal states in alignment with social and environmental context. Attention and focus were cultivated through witnessing. Stories often required sustained observation, particularly when shadows and gestures were used to dramatize events. The child learned to track details, maintain engagement, and discern meaning in complex, multimodal signals. This attentional practice enhanced memory and comprehension, allowing lessons to be internalized and later applied. Witnessing, therefore, was a multifaceted activity. It engaged mind, body, and emotion, preparing children for the cognitive demands of daily life in a world full of unpredictability. Witnessing also reinforced moral and social lessons embedded in narrative. The child observed consequences of action and inaction, bravery and fear, selfishness and cooperation. By attending closely to these narrative outcomes, children internalized social norms, ethical principles, and communal values. Shadows and gestures amplified the narrative, providing concrete visual analogues for abstract concepts. The child's mind learned to interpret behavior, anticipate outcomes, and develop a moral framework, all within the secure and immersive environment of the storytelling ritual. This active engagement strengthened memory consolidation. Multisensory experience, sound, sight, touch, and emotional resonance, enhanced encoding and recall. The child who witnessed the hunt, the predator, or the cooperation of the tribe did not merely remember events, they remembered lessons, emotional patterns, and strategies for action. Witnessing transformed storytelling from ephemeral entertainment into a durable cognitive and cultural experience, ensuring that crucial knowledge and social norms were transmitted across generations. Witnessing also involved imaginative co-creation. Children often filled in narrative gaps, projected intentions onto characters, or experimented with alternate scenarios. The caregiver's story became a scaffold for the child's imaginative participation, fostering creativity, problem-solving, and flexible thinking. By actively engaging with narrative rather than passively consuming it, the child developed mental agility and capacity for abstract thought. Early storytelling was thus a collaborative enterprise, with the child as both observer and co-creator, learning to navigate the interplay of reality, imagination, and moral meaning. Importantly, witnessing fostered anticipatory thinking. By attending to story patterns, vocal inflection, and shadow movements, children learn to predict outcomes, assess risks, and plan responses. This capacity for foresight was crucial for survival in a prehistoric environment. The child who could anticipate the predator's behavior, the river's movement, or the tribe's needs held a cognitive advantage. Storytelling, therefore, was not only cultural or emotional, it was a practical rehearsal for the challenges of life in a dangerous and unpredictable world. The act of witnessing also strengthened relational bonds. Being present in the storytelling circle created shared experience and mutual recognition between child and caregiver. Emotional attunement was heightened as the child's reactions were observed, acknowledged, and sometimes incorporated into the narrative. Witnessing became a reciprocal process. The child learned from the caregiver, and the caregiver responded to the child, creating a dynamic interplay of observation, communication, and emotional synchronization. This relational dimension reinforced trust, attachment, and social cohesion. Witnessing also provided a foundation for self-awareness. By observing others' reactions to events and interpreting their own emotional responses in relation to the story, children began to differentiate self from other, internal states from external circumstances, and imagined possibilities from immediate reality. This early metacognition laid the groundwork for reflection, empathy, and moral reasoning, allowing children to navigate both their inner and outer worlds with greater sophistication. Stories often presented ethical dilemmas, challenges, and conflict. Through witnessing, the child learned to evaluate options, consider consequences, and internalize lessons about fairness, cooperation, and courage. Shadow, gesture, and voice dramatized the stakes of the narrative, making abstract principles tangible and emotionally resonant. The child was not merely told what was right or wrong, they observed, interpreted, and experienced the moral landscape firsthand, embedding understanding in both mind and heart. Witnessing was also a rehearsal for future storytelling. By observing narrative structure, pacing, and performance, children internalized patterns that they could later replicate or adapt. These early lessons in narrative construction, rhythm, and audience engagement ensured the continuity of cultural knowledge. The child became not only a witness but a future storyteller, capable of transmitting lessons, values, and comfort to the next generation. Storytelling was thus both a personal and communal legacy, reinforced through attentive witnessing. Finally, the child as witness embodies the profound interconnectedness of perception, emotion, cognition, and culture. Witnessing transformed storytelling from a simple act of communication into an immersive, relational, and educational experience. Children learn to read the world, navigate emotional landscapes, anticipate consequences, and co-create narrative meaning. The firelit circle, with its shadows, melodies, and gestures, was a laboratory in which mind and heart were shaped simultaneously, and in which the first stories told to comfort a child became instruments of learning, empathy, and cultural continuity. In observing, interpreting, and internalizing these early narratives, the child emerged not only soothed and comforted, but also prepared for the complex social, moral, and environmental challenges of life. Witnessing was active, immersive, and transformative. It cultivated attention, imagination, emotional intelligence, moral reasoning, and social cognition. The first stories, experienced through witnessing, were more than tales. They were formative experiences that shaped the very architecture of the developing human mind, embedding knowledge, empathy, and resilience at the heart of human culture. In the firelit circle, the story functioned as more than mere entertainment. It became a bridge between worlds, between fear and comfort, the known and the unknown, the child and the caregiver, the present and the lessons of the past. The first stories told to comfort a child were conduits, connecting the immediate experience of uncertainty with understanding, meaning, and emotional safety. Through narrative, the child traversed psychological landscapes that were otherwise inaccessible, learning to navigate danger, morality, and imagination in a structured and supported way. This bridging function was deeply embodied. As the child listened, watched shadows, and felt the warmth of proximity, story wove together sensory input, cognition, and emotion. A tale of a predator, for example, linked the abstract idea of danger with visceral sensations, a flickering shadow representing a stalking animal, the caregiver's voice rising in caution, the rhythmic crackle of fire. These elements were synthesized in the child's mind, creating a bridge between immediate perception and the broader understanding of threat, response, and survival strategy. The story also bridged temporal dimensions. While the child experienced the moment, the narrative often referenced events in the past, lessons learned, ancestors' encounters, or the repetition of natural cycles. In this way, storytelling connected the child to a temporal continuum, situating personal experience within collective memory and the ongoing life of the tribe. The child was simultaneously present and historically aware, learning that survival, morality, and social cohesion were not isolated events but part of a larger pattern of human experience. Bridging extended to emotional regulation. The story's arc, with tension, suspense, and resolution, guided the child through emotional states, connecting anxiety with reassurance, fear with courage, and uncertainty with understanding. Through repeated exposure, children learned that emotional experiences could be navigated safely, that fear could be acknowledged and contained, and that resilience could be cultivated. The story became a bridge from raw, unprocessed emotion to regulated, meaningful experience, providing a template for future encounters with uncertainty. The caregiver's presence reinforced the bridge. Voice, gesture, touch, and attentional engagement connected the narrative to the child's immediate reality, ensuring that abstract lessons were grounded in relational and environmental context. This relational anchoring made the story tangible, meaningful, and actionable. The child could connect narrative lessons with real-world observations, guided by a trusted adult who modeled comprehension, response, and care. The bridge was thus both cognitive and emotional, linking internal and external worlds. Stories also bridged imagination and reality. Shadows and gestures provided stimuli that the mind could interpret creatively, while narrative structure offered guidance and coherence. The child learned to project, anticipate, and experiment within the safe confines of the story, integrating imaginative exploration with practical knowledge. This bridging function fostered problem-solving, creative thinking, and adaptive reasoning, illustrating how early narrative was simultaneously educational and experiential. The bridge extended to morality and social understanding. By observing the consequences of characters' actions, children learned that behavior had impact, that cooperation could yield success, and that selfishness might carry consequences. The story connected abstract ethical principles to observable outcomes, allowing the child to internalize social norms and moral reasoning through vicarious experience. Shadows, voice, and gesture dramatized these lessons, transforming them into emotionally resonant, memorable experiences that bridged theory and practice. Anthropologists suggest that storytelling as a bridge was a critical factor in the evolution of human culture. By connecting individual experience to communal knowledge, narrative facilitated the transmission of survival strategies, emotional wisdom, and social norms. The child was not simply a recipient of information but a participant in a shared cultural process, learning to navigate both immediate and inherited challenges. Story bridged generations, ensuring continuity and cohesion within early human societies. Bridging also occurred within the child's cognitive development. Stories required attention, memory, interpretation, and prediction. The child connected narrative elements, visual stimuli, and emotional cues to construct coherent understanding. By linking discrete sensory and cognitive inputs into integrated meaning, the story functioned as a scaffold for complex thought. The child learned not only content but also processes, how to synthesize information, anticipate outcomes, and navigate complexity, skills essential for survival and social participation. The bridge extended to language itself. Through repeated exposure to narrative patterns, rhythm, and vocabulary, the child internalized linguistic structures, expanding comprehension and expressive capacity. Words became tools to connect ideas, emotions, and actions. Story served as a bridge between pre-verbal cognition and verbal expression, facilitating the development of communication skills, abstract thought, and cultural participation. In this sense, the first narratives laid the foundation for the evolution of human language and conceptual reasoning. The story also connected the child to the natural environment. Tales of rivers, predators, weather patterns, and the behavior of animals embedded ecological knowledge within narrative. Through imagination and observation, the child learned about cause and effect, survival strategies, and environmental awareness. Shadows and gestures dramatized natural forces, making abstract concepts tangible. Story acted as a bridge between experiential learning and abstract understanding, allowing children to navigate their environment with knowledge, caution, and creativity. Emotion and cognition were linked across the bridge of story. The child experienced fear, empathy, curiosity, and joy in ways that were simultaneously visceral and reflective. Narrative arcs connected emotional states to understanding, allowing the child to navigate complex feelings, internalize lessons, and practice social and moral reasoning. Story as a bridge provided a safe channel through which the intensity of experience could be transformed into insight and resilience. Bridging also encompassed social connection. Storytelling connected child and caregiver, child and community, present and ancestral knowledge. Shared attention, emotional synchronization, and collaborative imagination reinforced bonds while transmitting cultural knowledge. The child learned that understanding and empathy were not solitary endeavors but relational processes embedded in the rhythms of communal life. Story thus bridged individual development with collective participation, fostering both personal and societal growth. Finally, the story as a bridge illustrates the profound human capacity to create meaning. In darkness and flickering light, through gesture, voice, and shadow, narrative connected mind to mind, present to past, emotion to reason, and imagination to reality. The first stories to comfort a child were more than tales, they were conduits of survival, culture, emotion, and cognition. By spanning gaps between fear and understanding, chaos and order, the unknown and the known, the story became a bridge that shaped human experience, preparing children to navigate the world with curiosity, empathy, and resilience. Through these fire-lit, shadowed rituals, children learned to traverse inner and outer landscapes, connecting observation, imagination, and relational experience. They learned to understand the natural and social world, anticipate consequences, and regulate emotion. The story was simultaneously anchor, guide, and bridge, a transformative tool that linked experience with insight, vulnerability with resilience, and individual learning with cultural continuity. In the circle of firelight, the first storytellers demonstrated humanity's enduring power to bridge gaps, forge understanding, and transform fear into knowledge, comfort, and connection. In the glow of the fire, as shadows flickered across cave walls, comfort emerged not as a fleeting moment but as a cornerstone of culture. The first stories told to soothe a child were deeply intertwined with communal identity, values, and shared understanding. Comfort was not merely an emotional response, it was an intentional act embedded within ritual, relationship, and narrative. By comforting a child through story, early humans were transmitting knowledge, shaping emotional resilience, and cultivating a shared sense of belonging, a cultural act as vital as any survival skill. Comfort in this context was multifaceted. It involved safety, yes, but also predictability, attentional attunement, and emotional regulation. The caregiver's presence, the rhythm of the narrative, and the interplay of shadows and gestures created an environment where the child could confront fear, uncertainty, or sadness without being overwhelmed. Comfort was therefore not passive reassurance, it was structured, dynamic, and profoundly relational. Within these stories, children learned that the world, though complex and often dangerous, contained spaces of care, guidance, and stability. Stories became vessels of cultural continuity. Through narrative, children absorbed not only lessons about predators, weather, or survival strategies, but also communal values, ethics, and social norms. Tales that emphasized cooperation, courage, empathy, and fairness conveyed the principles on which the group functioned. Comfort was inseparable from culture. By experiencing emotional security in the context of shared story, children internalized not only emotional regulation but also moral reasoning and social understanding. To comfort a child was to initiate them into the shared human endeavor of communal life. The ritualized nature of storytelling reinforced this cultural function. Repetition, timing, and pattern gestures created a framework that connected generations. Children heard the same stories told by different caregivers across seasons and in varied contexts, creating a sense of continuity and stability. Each telling was a living link to the past, embedding cultural memory and shared identity. In this way, comfort became a vehicle for transmitting both emotional and cultural intelligence, ensuring that knowledge, values, and relational norms endured. Language itself was a medium of comfort and culture. The rhythm, repetition, and intonation of words conveyed meaning beyond literal content. Songs, chants, or poetic phrasing embedded in stories enhanced memorability, emotional resonance, and relational attunement. The child learned patterns of communication, expressive nuance, and symbolic thinking, all within a safe and emotionally supportive environment. Comfort and culture were intertwined. Linguistic structures shaped emotional experience, while emotional engagement reinforced comprehension and cultural transmission. Physical proximity and gesture reinforced these lessons. A hand on the shoulder, a gentle embrace, or a guiding touch connected the abstract story to tangible experience. Children learned that comfort was both conceptual and embodied, that care was communicated through presence, attention, and action. This integration of narrative, emotion, and physical reassurance strengthened attachment, trust, and relational intelligence, creating a foundation for lifelong social and emotional competence. Comfort as culture extended to imagination and creativity. By experiencing emotional reassurance within narrative, children were encouraged to explore hypothetical scenarios, project themselves into characters' experiences, and experiment with outcomes. The secure environment allowed them to take imaginative risks, develop problem-solving skills, and expand cognitive flexibility. Storytelling transformed comfort into a platform for growth, turning emotional safety into a laboratory for mind and imagination. This cultural function was amplified by communal participation. Stories were often shared among groups, creating synchronized emotional experiences. Children observed how others reacted, learned from communal responses, and developed social intelligence alongside emotional resilience. Comfort was never entirely individual, it was relational and social, embedding the child within a web of care, empathy, and shared understanding. Through story, the tribe's culture of support was enacted, witnessed, and internalized. Furthermore, comfort was deeply connected to survival. A child who felt safe and soothed could attend more fully to lessons, remember strategies, and engage with the environment more effectively. Emotional regulation fostered through story was not merely psychological but adaptive. Comfort allowed children to process fear, manage anxiety, and develop resilience, capacities essential for navigating the challenges of a prehistoric world. In this way, emotional care and cultural continuity were inseparable from practical survival. Stories often encoded moral and ethical lessons within comforting frameworks. Characters who overcame fear, cooperated, or demonstrated courage modeled behaviors that were both socially and practically advantageous. Shadows, gestures, and vocal modulation dramatized these principles, making abstract concepts emotionally resonant and memorable. Comfort did not dilute the lesson. It amplified comprehension by allowing the child to engage fully without being overwhelmed. In essence, emotional safety enabled moral and cognitive learning. The intergenerational aspect of comfort as culture is also striking. Caregivers, themselves shaped by stories told in their own childhood, transmitted both emotional strategies and cultural knowledge. Storytelling became a continuous chain connecting ancestors, present caregivers, and the next generation. Comfort was a ritualized act that reinforced identity, belonging, and collective memory, ensuring that emotional intelligence and cultural norms were preserved across time. Even adversity was reframed within this cultural act. Dangerous or frightening scenarios in stories, predators, storms, or loss, were experienced within a scaffold environment of care. Children learned that danger could be understood, navigated, and survived. Emotional resilience, social understanding, and problem-solving were all cultivated within these narratives. Comfort was both a shield and a bridge, protecting the child while connecting them to knowledge, values, and skills essential for life. Anthropologists emphasize that comfort and culture are deeply entwined in human evolution. Emotional support through storytelling was not ancillary, it was fundamental to cognitive, social, and cultural development. By nurturing children in ways that integrated emotional, moral, and practical learning, early humans ensured not only survival but the perpetuation of knowledge, social cohesion, and cultural identity. Comfort was an active, dynamic, and profoundly adaptive cultural practice. Ultimately, comfort as culture illustrates the inseparability of emotion, cognition, and communal life. In the firelit circle, the child learned to navigate fear, explore imagination, and internalize values, all while feeling held, attended to, and understood. The act of comforting was therefore simultaneously personal and cultural. It nurtured the individual while embedding them within the shared tapestry of human experience. Through story, early humans demonstrated that emotional care and cultural continuity are not separate endeavors but mutually reinforcing acts, foundational to the growth of mind, heart, and society. Through these intertwined practices, comfort became more than a transient sensation. It became a medium through which culture, ethics, survival knowledge, and relational intelligence were transmitted. The child, soothed and engaged, absorbed not only the story's content but also its rhythms, relational cues, and cultural significance. Comfort shaped the child's emotional, cognitive, and social development, embedding patterns that would inform understanding, empathy, and identity throughout life. In the dance of shadow, sound, and gesture, the first stories revealed their enduring power. They were instruments of care, vehicles of culture, and frameworks for understanding the human condition. Comfort, far from being a simple act, was a sophisticated, adaptive, and profoundly human cultural practice, one that ensured the survival not only of individuals but of the knowledge, values, and emotional wisdom that define humanity itself. Storytelling in the prehistoric world was more than the spontaneous utterance of events. It was carefully structured, almost architectural in its design. The first stories told to comfort a child were meticulously constructed to balance suspense, emotion, and understanding. Just as a building relies on foundational supports, pillars, and deliberate spatial arrangement, early narratives relied on recurring motifs, rhythm, gesture, and shadow to create a coherent and immersive experience. Every element served a purpose, guiding attention, shaping emotion, and embedding lessons in a way that was both memorable and transformative. The foundation of early storytelling was structure. Stories followed arcs that were intuitive yet sophisticated, often beginning with familiar context, introducing conflict or tension, and concluding with resolution or reassurance. This pattern mirrored the child's experience of the world, safe in familiar routines, confronted with challenges, and guided to understanding or safety. The architecture of narrative allowed children to anticipate, process, and internalize lessons, providing both cognitive scaffolding and emotional support. In essence, narrative structure created a predictable yet engaging framework in which learning and comfort could coexist. Central to this architecture was the interplay of sensory elements. Firelight, shadow, voice, and gesture were all strategically employed to enhance comprehension and emotional resonance. Shadows illustrated danger, gestures emphasized action, and vocal modulation guided attention and emotional response. The child's mind connected these multimodal cues into coherent meaning, strengthening both memory and understanding. Just as the arches and beams of a building distribute weight and maintain stability, these sensory components distributed emotional and cognitive load, enabling children to engage fully without being overwhelmed. Repetition formed another key pillar of narrative architecture. Recurrent phrases, melodic patterns, or structural motifs provided rhythm and predictability, making lessons easier to grasp and internalize. Repetition also fostered comfort. The child could anticipate elements of the story, creating a sense of stability amid dramatic or frightening content. By blending familiarity with novelty, early storytellers crafted narratives that were simultaneously secure and stimulating, balancing reassurance with engagement. The architecture of storytelling also incorporated spatial awareness. In caves, children were positioned relative to firelight and shadows to maximize the narrative's impact. Proximity to the storyteller, orientation toward flickering shadows, and communal arrangement all influenced engagement. The physical space became part of the story structure, embedding narrative in the environment itself. This integration of spatial, visual, and auditory cues allowed the story to function as a three-dimensional immersive experience, connecting mind, body, and context. Emotional pacing was another essential component. Just as architecture guides movement and focus, narrative pacing directed attention and emotional response. Moments of tension were carefully modulated with pauses, softer tones, or reassuring gestures. Climactic scenes were interspersed with resolution and reflection, allowing the child to process experience and internalize lessons. This careful orchestration of emotional highs and lows cultivated resilience, empathy, and understanding while also reinforcing memory and cognitive engagement. Gesture and physical interaction served as functional beams within the narrative framework. A touch on the shoulder, a hand pointing to a shadow, or a gentle embrace emphasized key points, guided attention, and reinforced emotional connection. These physical interventions were not random, they were deliberate, enhancing both comprehension and comfort. In architectural terms, gestures acted like structural supports, ensuring that narrative weight was distributed effectively and that the child remained anchored within the story's emotional and cognitive flow. The layering of meaning was a hallmark of early narrative design. Stories contained multiple levels of instruction, practical survival knowledge, social norms, moral reasoning, emotional regulation, and imaginative exploration were all embedded within the same tale. Children absorbed these lessons simultaneously, connecting observable events with symbolic meaning. The architecture of storytelling allowed complexity to be navigated safely, enabling children to integrate multiple forms of learning without being overwhelmed. Temporal structuring was equally important. Stories often referenced past events, seasonal cycles, or ancestral knowledge, connecting immediate experience to broader temporal frameworks. The child learned to situate themselves within ongoing patterns, understanding that actions had consequences and that knowledge was cumulative. Just as architecture provides orientation within space, narrative structure provided orientation within time, linking personal experience with collective memory and environmental rhythms. Community and relational dynamics were also embedded within narrative architecture. Multiple children or family members participated in storytelling, observing each other's reactions, anticipating responses, and internalizing social norms. The story scaffolded relational learning. Children learned to read cues, coordinate attention, and interpret emotional signals within a safe, structured environment. Storytelling was therefore simultaneously individual and communal, building cognitive, emotional, and social architecture in parallel. Symbolism functioned as both decoration and reinforcement within the narrative framework. Shadows, repetitive motifs, or metaphoric actions conveyed meaning that transcended literal events. A shadowy predator, for example, represented both real-world danger and broader lessons about vigilance, courage, or cooperation. Symbolic elements enriched understanding, strengthened memory, and allowed abstraction. Children learned not only what to fear or do but also how to interpret signs, anticipate outcomes, and draw moral or practical conclusions. Flexibility within structure was a subtle but essential feature. While stories followed recognizable patterns, storytellers adapted content based on the child's emotional state, reactions, or developmental needs. Novel elements were introduced to challenge, entertain, or teach, while familiar structures ensured continuity and reassurance. This dynamic adaptability ensured that the architecture of storytelling was both robust and responsive, capable of supporting learning, comfort, and emotional growth simultaneously. The integration of imagination and reality was central to narrative architecture. Shadows and gestures allowed abstract concepts to become tangible, while the story framework provided coherence and guidance. Children learned to traverse the boundary between observation and creativity, reality and speculation, danger and safety. The structured interplay of imagination and reality fostered cognitive flexibility, emotional regulation, and problem-solving, preparing the child to navigate both mental and environmental landscapes. Finally, the architecture of early storytelling highlights the sophistication and intentionality of prehistoric human culture. Stories were not random, they were carefully constructed systems of sensory, cognitive, emotional, and social engagement. They provided a scaffold for learning, a safe space for emotional processing, a medium for cultural transmission, and a framework for imaginative exploration. In this architecture, comfort, education, morality, and creativity were inseparably intertwined. Through these carefully designed immersive experiences, children learned to process fear, regulate emotion, internalize moral lessons, develop imagination, and navigate social complexity. The story's architecture supported holistic development, ensuring that knowledge, emotional intelligence, and cultural continuity were embedded seamlessly. Shadows, firelight, voice, gesture, repetition, and structure were all components of a coherent, intentional system, a blueprint for the mind, body, and culture. In the circle of firelight, the first storytellers demonstrated a remarkable understanding of human development. By designing narrative as architecture, they created enduring scaffolds that nurtured survival, social cohesion, morality, and imagination. The child, soothed and engaged, emerged not only comforted but also prepared, emotionally resilient, socially aware, cognitively adept, and culturally embedded. The architecture of storytelling was, in essence, the framework of human civilization itself, an enduring structure of mind, emotion, and culture built long before written records or formal education. Storytelling was never confined to a single moment or a single listener. In prehistoric life, the first stories told to comfort a child resonated far beyond the immediate circle of firelight, echoing across generations. Each tale carried lessons, emotions, and cultural knowledge, linking past, present, and future. These narratives functioned as vessels of memory, preserving the accumulated wisdom of ancestors while preparing children to face the challenges of their own time. In this way, storytelling was not merely personal, it was profoundly generational, a bridge that connected lives across decades and centuries. The echoes began with repetition. Stories were retold, sometimes nightly, sometimes across seasons, becoming embedded in the collective consciousness of the group. Children who listened grew into adults who remembered, adapted, and retold these narratives to their own offspring. In each telling, elements were preserved, emphasized, or subtly modified, creating continuity and adaptation simultaneously. These repeated echoes ensured that knowledge, values, and emotional strategies were not lost but instead reinforced and transmitted through lived experience. Beyond practical knowledge, stories transmitted emotional wisdom. By observing caregivers' tone, gestures, and responses to narrative events, children learned strategies for coping with fear, uncertainty, and grief. This emotional guidance, preserved and echoed across generations, became a cornerstone of communal resilience. Adults who had once been children in the circle of firelight carried these lessons into their interactions, maintaining continuity of care, empathy, and relational understanding within the tribe. Emotional echoes were as vital as cognitive or practical lessons, forming the foundation for enduring social cohesion. Storytelling also preserved cultural identity. Each narrative contained markers of tribal values, moral principles, and social norms. The echoes of these stories allowed children to internalize the ethical frameworks and cooperative strategies essential for survival and harmony. Through repeated transmission, the group's collective identity was reinforced. Children grew to understand not only how to survive but how to belong, contributing to a sense of unity and shared purpose that transcended individual lifespans. The medium of storytelling itself enhanced these generational echoes. Firelight, shadows, gestures, and voice created multisensory experiences that were memorable and evocative. The sensory richness of narrative facilitated long-term retention, allowing lessons to be vividly recalled and emotionally resonant even years later. Children who had internalized these stories carried their meaning forward, shaping behavior, imagination, and moral reasoning long after the fire had dimmed. In this sense, storytelling created a temporal bridge, a living archive of human experience. Echoes across generations also encompassed imagination and creativity. Children who participated in storytelling not only absorbed lessons but also learned to extend and adapt them. They filled narrative gaps, reimagined outcomes, and experimented with new interpretations, enriching the stories for future listeners. This iterative process ensured that stories were both stable and dynamic, preserving core wisdom while allowing flexibility and innovation. Each retelling became a dialogue across time where imagination and tradition coexisted and reinforced each other. Furthermore, storytelling linked survival strategies across generations. Tales of hunting, gathering, natural hazards, and predator encounters encoded practical knowledge crucial for life in a dangerous world. Children internalized these lessons through immersive narrative experience, and as adults, they applied and adapted this knowledge, ensuring continuity of effective strategies. Generational echoes thus had a concrete adaptive function. They bridged the experience of ancestors with the practical needs of the present and future. Moral and social lessons were amplified by repetition and observation. By witnessing the consequences of characters' choices, children internalized principles of cooperation, fairness, courage, and empathy. These lessons, reinforced across generations, became ingrained in the collective moral framework of the group. Storytelling was therefore a vehicle for ethical continuity, ensuring that cultural norms were maintained even as individuals came and went. Each echo reinforced shared understanding, trust, and cohesion within the community. Language played a critical role in these generational echoes. Through repeated exposure to narrative structure, vocabulary, and rhythm, children internalized communication patterns, expressive nuances, and symbolic reasoning. This linguistic inheritance enabled complex thought, abstract reasoning, and cultural participation, all transmitted across lifetimes. The echoes of stories thus reinforced not only content but also the very tools of human cognition and expression, shaping the minds of successive generations. Storytelling also created temporal awareness. By linking events to seasonal cycles, ancestral experiences, and communal memory, children learned to situate themselves within a continuum of time. This sense of historical and environmental context fostered foresight, planning, and strategic thinking. The echoes of past experiences guided present action, creating a continuity that connected individual lifetimes to the larger narrative of human survival and adaptation. The relational dimension of storytelling further reinforced generational echoes. As children witnessed interactions between caregivers, peers, and the narrative, they absorbed models of empathy, attention, and social coordination. These relational lessons were carried forward into adulthood, perpetuating cycles of care, mentorship, and cultural cohesion. Through storytelling, the patterns of connection and emotional attunement were not only learned but encoded into the fabric of communal life, echoing across generations as both practice and expectation. Imaginative participation was another conduit for echoing. Children internalized narrative motifs, character archetypes, and moral dilemmas, then reinterpreted them creatively in play, ritual, or retelling. These imaginative acts reinforced the story's endurance, allowing lessons to be adapted to new contexts while maintaining core wisdom. Echoes were thus both preservation and evolution. Each generation added nuance, depth, and personal insight, ensuring that stories remained relevant, engaging, and instructive. Echoes were not purely cognitive or emotional. They were embodied. Rituals, gestures, and performance styles were transmitted alongside narrative content, embedding lessons in action and presence. The child who experienced story physically and emotionally could replicate the ritual as an adult, maintaining continuity of performance, engagement, and cultural expression. Storytelling became a holistic practice, linking mind, body, and emotion across time. The generational echoes of storytelling reinforced communal resilience in the face of uncertainty. By transmitting knowledge, emotional strategies, moral reasoning, and cultural norms, stories equipped each new generation to navigate both immediate threats and long-term challenges. Each child who absorbed and later retold these stories contributed to the survival of knowledge, culture, and collective wisdom. The echoes were both a lifeline and a legacy, ensuring that lessons learned in one lifetime informed the next. Ultimately, the first stories told to comfort a child were more than ephemeral narratives. They were living bridges across time. They connected ancestors to descendants, past experience to future strategy, emotion to cognition, and imagination to reality. The echoes preserved memory, transmitted culture, nurtured resilience, and fostered imagination, ensuring that each generation benefited from the wisdom, care, and creativity of those who came before. Through these echoing stories, children were not only comforted in the moment, they became inheritors of a continuous chain of knowledge, empathy, and cultural identity. Each retelling strengthened the web of understanding, trust, and relational intelligence, linking the personal to the communal, the immediate to the ancestral. In this way, the fire-lit circle of early storytelling produced echoes that transcended time, shaping the development, resilience, and humanity of countless generations yet to come. Within the intimate circle of firelight, the first stories told to comfort a child carried a rhythm, a moral pulse, that guided attention, emotion, and understanding. This pulse was subtle but vital, weaving ethical instruction seamlessly into narrative, shaping the child's comprehension of right and wrong, courage and fear, selfishness and cooperation. The moral dimension of early storytelling was not imposed externally, it emerged organically from the interplay of events, consequences, and relational cues. Children absorbed these lessons as part of the narrative experience, internalizing the moral pulse through observation, emotion, and imagination. Cause, effect, and emotional resonance. The pulse was established through cause and effect. Actions taken by characters, whether brave, reckless, or kind, were linked to consequences that were immediate, vivid, and emotionally resonant. A child witnessing a character's folly might see the shadow of danger looming, hear the caregiver's voice rising in warning, or notice gestures emphasizing urgency. Conversely, cooperation or courage brought safety, reward, or harmony. By connecting actions with outcomes, the moral pulse provided a clear framework for understanding the social and ethical dimensions of life, helping children anticipate the implications of behavior in both narrative and real-world contexts. Emotion as the heartbeat of morality. Emotion played a central role in this moral rhythm. Stories were not abstract lectures, they were immersive experiences that engaged fear, empathy, anticipation, and relief. Children learned to associate emotional responses with ethical evaluation. Witnessing a character's suffering could evoke sadness or compassion. Observing bravery could inspire admiration or courage. These emotional cues acted as the heartbeat of morality, aligning feelings with comprehension and allowing ethical lessons to be experienced rather than merely instructed. Moral understanding was therefore embodied, not abstract. Gestures, repetition, and relational cues. Gestures and physical dramatization further amplified the moral pulse. A raised hand, a pointed finger, a reassuring touch, all reinforced the narrative's ethical stakes. Children learned that morality was relational, enacted and observed in the context of community. By linking movement, attention, and ethical consequence, storytellers created a multisensory experience in which morality was felt, seen, and understood. Repetition and pattern reinforced this pulse. Recurrent motifs, such as the reward for sharing or the peril of selfishness, embedded ethical understanding within the rhythm of the narrative. Repetition was not merely structural, it provided cognitive scaffolding, helping children recognize patterns of cause and consequence, anticipate outcomes, and internalize communal norms. The pulse was thus predictable yet dynamic, guiding attention and moral comprehension simultaneously. Moral reasoning and imaginative rehearsal. The moral pulse also functioned as a rehearsal for decision-making. Children observed how characters navigated dilemmas, faced danger, or cooperated with others. By mentally simulating these scenarios, they developed foresight, problem-solving skills, and the ability to weigh consequences. Storytelling allowed children to practice ethical reasoning in a safe imaginative environment, preparing them for real-life choices and reinforcing the interdependence of cognition, emotion, and morality. Communal learning and social ethics. The communal dimension of storytelling reinforced ethical understanding. Children witnessed not only the narrative but also the reactions of caregivers and peers. Emotional attunement, recognizing surprise, concern, approval, or admiration in others, fostered empathy, social learning, and moral insight. Ethical comprehension was thus relational, emerging through interaction and observation as the pulse of the story intertwined with the pulse of the group. Symbolism, metaphor, and temporal continuity. Symbolism and metaphor enriched the moral pulse. Shadows, animal characters, and dramatized dangers conveyed ethical lessons in ways that transcended literal events. A predatory shadow might represent not only immediate danger but also the broader consequences of recklessness or neglect. Such symbolism deepened comprehension, allowing moral truths to be felt, interpreted, and internalized on multiple levels. Temporal structure also contributed to the rhythm of morality. Stories often linked immediate action to future consequence, situating ethical decisions within a continuum of time. Children learned that morality was not fleeting. Actions carried enduring significance. The moral pulse connected present moment to ancestral wisdom and anticipated outcomes, cultivating foresight, responsibility, and ethical awareness. Survival, relational intelligence, and adaptive morality. Moral lessons were often intertwined with survival and relational intelligence. Courage, cooperation, and attentiveness were not abstract virtues, they were adaptive behaviors essential for thriving in a dangerous, interdependent world. By embedding these behaviors within story, early humans ensured that ethical development was inseparable from practical survival. The moral pulse thus guided emotional and strategic reasoning, aligning ethical understanding with lived reality. Imaginative engagement and internalization. Imaginative engagement further reinforced the moral rhythm. Children were invited to project themselves into characters' experiences, exploring alternative choices, consequences, and resolutions. This active participation allowed them to internalize lessons more deeply, cultivating ethical flexibility, creativity, and anticipatory thinking. The caregiver's modulation of tone, pauses, and gestures shaped the intensity of this moral pulse, ensuring key lessons were highlighted and emotionally anchored. An ethical framework for humanity. Over time, the moral pulse became internalized. Children who repeatedly experienced ethical narrative developed the capacity to anticipate consequences, regulate emotion, empathize with others, and navigate complex social situations. Early storytelling was not only comforting, it was formative, cultivating the ethical intelligence that underpins human society. Explicit lessons, such as the virtue of sharing or the danger of recklessness, were reinforced through direct consequences. Implicit lessons, such as emotional attunement, relational awareness, or anticipation of outcomes, were absorbed through observation, reflection, and imagination. The moral pulse synchronized these layers, ensuring children acquired a nuanced, embodied understanding of right, wrong, and relational responsibility. Ultimately, the moral pulse of narrative illustrates the sophistication and intentionality of prehistoric storytelling. Caregivers were not merely entertaining or soothing, they were shaping ethical understanding, emotional intelligence, and social competence. Through rhythm, repetition, gesture, shadow, and voice, early stories conveyed complex moral lessons, blending emotion, cognition, imagination, and social observation. The pulse of morality resonated deeply, guiding children's hearts and minds toward understanding, empathy, and ethical action. Through these immersive experiences, children were comforted, educated, and prepared for the challenges of life. Storytelling was simultaneously a tool of comfort, a scaffold for understanding, and a medium for transmitting the ethical heartbeat of human culture. In the firelit circle, morality was not taught abstractly, it was felt, witnessed, and lived, forming an enduring rhythm that echoed across time, shaping generations yet to come. In the quiet of the firelit cave, the first stories told to comfort a child left more than ephemeral warmth. They ignited a lasting flame, a continuity that bridged past, present, and future. This flame was both literal and metaphorical, the glow of fire casting shadows, the flicker of attention in the child's eyes, and the enduring spark of culture, imagination, and emotional intelligence that storytelling bequeathed to successive generations. The first stories were vessels of survival, empathy, and creativity, leaving a mark that outlived the transient moments of comfort and became a foundation for humanity itself. Memory, the first embers. The lasting flame begins with memory. Each story imprinted on the mind, layered with sensory and emotional resonance. Firelight, voice modulation, and gesture combined with narrative to create durable patterns of understanding. Children remembered not only events but also relational dynamics, moral lessons, and imaginative landscapes. These memories became resources they could draw upon in future challenges, both practical and emotional. The flame of story thus persisted, embedded within cognition and emotion, ready to illuminate the path of life even after the fire had dimmed. Continuity and belonging. The web of connection stories also kindled a sense of continuity and belonging. Within the circle of shared attention, children sensed themselves as part of something larger than the individual moment. Tales linked them to ancestors, peers, and future listeners, creating a temporal and communal web. The flame of narrative connected generations, conveying cultural identity, moral principles, and emotional strategies. In inheriting these stories, children were not only comforted, they were inducted into a lineage of human experience, a living tradition that ensured continuity of wisdom, resilience, and imagination. Emotional intelligence. The illuminating glow, the lasting flame carried emotional intelligence. Through narrative, children learned to navigate fear, joy, sorrow, and empathy. They experienced vicariously the consequences of action, the complexities of relationships, and the rhythm of courage and caution. By internalizing these experiences, they developed emotional agility and social insight, capacities that would serve them throughout life. This flame was not passive, it was active, illuminating the terrain of human feeling and guiding development in ways both subtle and profound. Practical knowledge. Lessons for survival. Practical knowledge was embedded in this flame. Tales of hunting, foraging, or environmental hazards preserved lessons essential for survival. By engaging with story, children rehearsed strategies for navigating the natural world. Shadows of predators, rhythms of animal movement, and patterns of environmental change were encoded within narrative, allowing children to internalize survival strategies through imagination and observation. The flame ensured that the wisdom of experience was passed forward, equipping each generation to endure and thrive. Morality. The ethical light, moral understanding burned within the narrative. Stories dramatized the consequences of choices, the value of cooperation, and the importance of courage and foresight. The moral pulse of storytelling illuminated ethical paths, helping children distinguish between beneficial and harmful actions. By witnessing characters navigate dilemmas, children internalized frameworks for evaluating behavior, cultivating empathy and relational understanding. The flame was a guide for ethical development, ensuring that communal values were transmitted and sustained across generations. Imagination. The creative spark. The flame also nurtured imagination, the creative spark that defines humanity. Through symbolic characters, metaphoric shadows, and dramatized scenarios, children developed the capacity to envision, simulate, and innovate. Imagination inherited through story allowed them to explore possibilities beyond immediate experience, fostering problem-solving, creativity, and flexible thinking. The lasting flame of narrative ensured that each generation could extend knowledge and culture, applying inherited insight in novel contexts. Relational continuity. Bonds through story. Another dimension of the flame was relational continuity. Children learned, through observation and participation, how to engage with caregivers, peers, and community members. Storytelling modeled attention, empathy, and social coordination. By internalizing these lessons, children were prepared to maintain the social fabric of their group, ensuring cohesion, collaboration, and mutual care. The lasting flame thus illuminated both individual and collective development, linking personal growth with communal stability. Symbolism, temporal awareness, and adaptability. Symbolism and metaphor intensified the durability of the flame. Shadows, repeated motifs, and archetypal figures carried layered meaning, allowing lessons to be absorbed on multiple levels simultaneously. Temporal awareness further reinforced the flame. Stories situated immediate experiences within broader sequences, ancestral memory, seasonal cycles, and projected futures. This orientation provided context for decision-making, strategic thinking, and relational understanding. The flame illuminated not only the present but the continuum of experience in which children were situated. Ritual, language, and the persistence of story memory, repetition, and ritual ensured the flame's endurance. Stories retold across nights, seasons, and generations maintained coherence, continuity, and adaptability. Language acted as both fuel and conduit. Vocal patterns, repetition, and narrative phrasing transmitted knowledge, meaning, and emotion. Children internalized linguistic structures, enhancing communication, symbolic thought, and abstract reasoning. The flame carried not only content but also the tools of cultural participation, allowing narrative to burn across time and space. An enduring inheritance. Ultimately, the lasting flame represents the enduring power of storytelling. From the first tales whispered to comfort a child, narrative has illuminated human minds and hearts, transmitting culture, morality, emotion, and imagination across generations. The stories may have been ephemeral in form, but their impact persisted, embedding knowledge, shaping understanding, and nurturing creativity. The firelight may fade, but the lessons, emotional resonance, and imaginative spark endure, an inheritance of human ingenuity, care, and wisdom. Through the circle of firelight, each child received more than comfort. They inherited a flame that would guide thought, action, and creativity throughout life. The first storytellers understood intuitively that nurturing imagination, empathy, and moral comprehension was as vital as protection from predators or hunger. The lasting flame of their stories illuminated paths forward, linking survival, culture, and human potential, echoing still in every tale, every lesson, and every creative endeavor today. In the quiet after the fire has dimmed and the last story has been told, shadows linger on the walls, flickering faintly in memory. These shadows are more than shapes, they are echoes of human thought, emotion, and imagination. The first stories told to comfort a child leave traces that ripple through mind and culture, reflections of understanding, empathy, and creativity. In these shadows, the child begins to see not only the world around them, but the human experience distilled into narrative, lesson, and reflection. Shadows as mirrors of thought. Reflections in the shadow reveal the depth of human cognition. The child lying close to the warmth of the fire internalizes narrative structure, moral consequences, and imaginative possibility. Each shadowed flicker corresponds to a cognitive imprint, recognizing cause and effect, predicting outcomes, and connecting sequences of action. Through observation, repetition, and emotional engagement, the mind absorbs complexity in a form that is accessible and profound. The shadow becomes a mirror, reflecting thought and understanding, shaping reasoning long after the storyteller has fallen silent. Emotional resonance in the shadows. Emotion lingers in the shadows as well. The tales of danger, heroism, cooperation, and care evoke responses that do not fade with the firelight. Fear, relief, empathy, and joy reverberate in the child's consciousness, linking feeling with comprehension. By reflecting on these experiences, the child learns emotional regulation, anticipatory awareness, and empathy, developing skills necessary for social life and survival. Shadows in this sense are not merely visual, they are vessels for memory, emotion, and reflection, carrying lessons forward into thought and action. Moral reflection in shadow. Moral reasoning is embedded within the shadow's reflection. The consequences faced by characters, both positive and negative, offer the child a framework for ethical understanding. Observing actions and outcomes, the child begins to internalize principles of fairness, courage, cooperation, and prudence. These lessons, absorbed in the intimate circle of story and shadow, are not abstract, they are experienced, felt, and rehearsed. Reflection allows the child to consider alternative choices, internalize communal norms, and integrate moral comprehension into their own behavior. Imagination sparked by light and shadow. Imagination is sparked and reinforced in the interplay of light and shadow. Flickering shapes on cave walls stimulate the mind to explore possibilities beyond the literal and immediate. A predator cast in shadow may transform into metaphor, a hero, or an abstract concept, inviting interpretation and creative thought. The child experiments with outcomes, scenarios, and consequences in a safe space, rehearsing cognitive and emotional strategies that will later support problem-solving, creativity, and social understanding. Shadows therefore serve as both stimulus and canvas for imagination, linking narrative experience to mental flexibility. Memory and the enduring impact of shadows. Reflection in the shadow also consolidates memory. Narrative, gesture, and voice are encoded alongside visual and emotional cues. The child recalls not only plot details but the emotional rhythm, moral weight, and imaginative framework of the story. This multilayered memory provides a scaffold for future learning, allowing knowledge to be applied in diverse contexts. Each reflection strengthens retention, making lessons resilient across time and circumstance. The shadow thus functions as both reminder and reinforcement, an interface between ephemeral experience and enduring cognition. Social and cultural understanding in reflection. Social and relational understanding is illuminated in these reflections. By recalling interactions within the story circle, the responses of caregivers, the attention of peers, and communal engagement, the child internalizes patterns of social behavior and relational intelligence. Observing reactions in the present and remembering them in reflection, the child learns empathy, cooperation, and perspective-taking. Shadows become mirrors of human connection, encoding the subtle dynamics of social life and embedding them in the child's emerging understanding of community. Cultural knowledge, too, is reflected. Stories contain motifs, rituals, and symbolic representations that carry accumulated wisdom. Shadows allow the child to contemplate these lessons in abstraction, considering not only immediate survival strategies but broader patterns of life, morality, and human experience. This interplay of narrative, imagination, and reflection ensures that culture is transmitted and internalized, embedding values, practical knowledge, and creative frameworks in ways that endure beyond the immediate storytelling moment. Temporal awareness and resilience. Temporal awareness emerges in reflection. By thinking about past events within the story, the child learns to situate experiences within sequences, cycles, and causality. The shadow of a previous action reflects consequences, the flicker of a future possibility stimulates foresight. Through reflection, the child develops an understanding of time, planning, and continuity, connecting personal experience to larger patterns of natural and social life. This reflective experience strengthens resilience. By revisiting moments of tension, danger, and emotional intensity in memory, the child practices coping strategies and emotional regulation. Reflection allows rehearsal of action and anticipation of outcomes, enabling mental preparation for real-world challenges. Shadows, as lingering presences of story, support adaptive cognition, embedding lessons in both memory and imagination. Language, symbolism, and depth of insight. Language internalized through repeated narrative also resonates in the shadow. Words, cadence, and phrasing guide thought, facilitate imagination, and reinforce comprehension. Reflection allows children to manipulate these linguistic tools creatively, rehearsing ideas, retelling narratives internally, and constructing new connections. The interplay of narrative, memory, and reflection strengthens both cognitive and creative capacities, ensuring that the flame of storytelling endures through thought as well as speech. Metaphor and symbolism in the shadows deepen insight. A flickering image may represent multiple layers of meaning, inviting contemplation and reinterpretation. The child learns to consider abstract connections, moral complexity, and relational dynamics. Reflection transforms visual and narrative cues into conceptual understanding, blending emotion, cognition, and imagination into coherent insight. Generational continuity of reflection. The reflective process is iterative and generational. Memories, imagination, and understanding formed in shadow guide future storytelling. Children who internalize lessons and imaginative frameworks will later recount stories to the next generation, perpetuating cycles of learning, culture, and empathy. Reflection in shadow ensures continuity, connecting individual cognition to communal memory and the unfolding human narrative. The enduring purpose of shadows. Ultimately, reflections in the shadow reveal the subtle genius of prehistoric storytelling. By combining narrative, gesture, emotion, sensory input, and imagination, early humans created experiences that were deeply immersive, educational, and comforting. Shadows provided a medium for reflection, rehearsal, and integration, extending the impact of storytelling far beyond the immediate moment. The child, soothed by the story and guided by the shadow, becomes both recipient and future transmitter of this complex living inheritance. In the stillness of post-story reflection, the child contemplates the lessons, moral rhythms, and imaginative possibilities embedded in narrative. The firelight may fade, the storyteller may rest, but the shadows persist, silent guides for thought, emotion, and imagination. Through these reflective shadows, the first stories told to comfort a child achieve their enduring purpose. They educate, nurture, and connect, embedding knowledge, morality, imagination, and emotional insight within the child's developing mind. The shadows carry the echo of the flame, the resonance of story, and the inheritance of humanity itself.